loading at the moment, and then we'll start welcoming everybody. And then Masuma will come straight to you. And we'll just go for it, just loading at the moment, and then we'll just start welcoming everybody. And then Masuma will come straight to you.
I have unmuted myself, so hopefully that should save a minute.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for session number 5. So we are more than halfway there now, Rose, with regards to this online conference. Fantastic. And those of you who have been with us on this little journey so far will have heard some absolutely phenomenal talks with regards to responsible raw materials. So how do we go and find beautiful rocks like these in a responsible manner? How do we dig them out of the ground, process them, sell them, buy them, govern them in the most responsible manner possible? How do we go about doing that? And that's what we've been talking about with regards to this conference. And we've had some brilliant speakers, all bringing different perspectives to the fore. And we've also had some fantastic attendees as well, asking us lots of absolutely wonderful questions to really broaden our thoughts with regards to this topic as a whole. So with regards to this, those of you who are attendees on Zoom, I won't go into all the details of how to use Zoom because I'm sure you are all experts now, but needless to say, the key buttons that you need are just down at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to chat with us. Feel free to raise your little blue hands to get hold of our attention, and feel free, of course, to ask us lots of questions. You will see on the screen in front of you that we have lots of lovely speakers who have dialed in nice and early, who are all here eager to hear your questions and to address all of those comments and ideas that you have. So please get them rolling into us as a whole, which is absolutely brilliant. I am not going to speak for very much longer, apart from to say my name is Dr. Sarah Gordon. So if you need to send a question to me, just ask for Sarah, as it were. And I'm one of the co-organisers of this online conference together with Rose Clark. Rose, give us a wave. There we go. That was a woohoo. And so we've put together this conference for you over the course of this week. I'm sure that most of you have managed to find the website. The key page on the website is the abstracts page, and I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you so that you will be able to see this. So if you go to the website and you click on abstracts, importantly on here, you will see all of our lovely abstracts that have been submitted by all of our wonderful speakers. Now, to sort through them, if you click on Wednesday afternoon, because that's what the time is here in the UK where we are based, you will see all of the abstracts for the lovely speakers that we have here today. And if you click into one of them, so for example, if I go into Remy's talk here, you'll see that his abstract has been uploaded, and it's into this space as well that we will be saving all of the videos from the talks that have been given today. So if you want to refer to them later, or you want to just come back and watch yourselves again, then this is where they will be uploaded. You will also notice that there is a donate now button, and that takes you to the Virgin money giving page, and you will see that we've had some incredibly generous donations. So thank you very much to all of you who have donated money to some of these fantastic charities, all of whom who are addressing different aspects with regards to either raw materials or COVID-19. And you'll notice here we're currently sitting on £965.75. So a challenge for you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see if we can get over that £1,000 mark, and there'll be a special prize and kudos for the person who gets us over that mark now. So thank you very much with regards to that. And I think my share screen has just stopped doing it, but that's okay. Thank you very much, Rose. With regards to all of this, obviously all the material is there on the website, okay, and you can get access to all of that. We're also streaming live on YouTube as well. So you'll be able to catch up with everything that we're up to on the YouTube channel. So just a note to all of our speakers here today, yes, you are being broadcast live around the world. Also a note to all of those of you who will be sending in lovely questions and chat to us. We really do welcome all perspectives that are out there, and please just let's be respectful of one another's perspectives and ideas, because that's how we learn from one another as a whole. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go straight away to our first speaker who we have today. So Masuma, who's already taken herself off mute because she's so well prepared. And Masuma, if you want to start sharing your slides now, if you want to go for it, I'm going to hand straight over to you, because Masuma is going to talk to us about responsible sourcing, and I'm loving the title, Mind the Gap. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah and Rose, for organizing this and inviting me to rant about responsible sourcing, because this is what this presentation is going to be. I have a background in development economics and policy, and for the last couple of years, I've been working with lawyers, which is an interesting intellectual challenge in itself. And one of the favorite phrases that lawyers tend to use is compliance with regulation. And when we talk about responsible mining, the question that keeps coming up is, what is the regulation? What are the rules that you expect us to follow? Are these regulations fit for purpose? Are these rules fit for purpose? And the other question is compliance. How do you know you've complied? How do you prove you've complied? How do you certify that you've complied? And based on those conversations, I'm just doing an opening thought process here of saying, when we talk about responsible raw materials and responsibly sourcing these materials, where are we coming from? This was also part of a Horizon 2020 funded project called Responsible Sourcing. We've just started, we're going to run for 4 years. And one of the first tasks that we did under that project was to see what is the state of play when it comes to approaches to responsible sourcing. And these two gentlemen, I believe Lee and Bazillion, have done a brilliant job in showing how messed up, well, okay, sorry, that's maybe not the right phrase, how dense and unconnected and all over the place the question of responsible sourcing approaches is. Some of these approaches are coming from the United Nations, ICMM, from mining companies, from the IFC, from the OECD. And there is a reason behind this messiness, because you have a number of actors working in different disciplines trying to address an issue which is very, very large. So that messiness is natural at this point in time. But the question is, where do we go from here? If you're a medium-sized mining company or a small SME sourcing minerals, how do you make sense of what is on the screen at the moment? Where is the narrative? Where is the, here's where you go, this is what the rules are, this is how you comply question to it. Now, in examining these approaches, we decided to step back and see what is the method behind what people are setting out for companies within responsible sourcing. And within that, you find two characterizations. There's a set of guidelines or rules which fall under management systems, and there's one which is around data and collection of information. And you've got three categories of tools which are being offered within these characterizations. The first is employing due diligence and tracking templates. Now, due diligence is a management system. It's a template that says, have you checked for human rights risk? Have you identified it? How are you going to deal with it? Have you just checked for environmental risks? So it's a due diligence template. And for data and information, everybody knows about blockchain. How do you provide the information? How do you say this information is not corrupted and cannot be corrupted down the road? A second set of tool comes from adopting business strategies and operations towards responsible sourcing. Now, this has mostly required commitment at the board level, connecting bonuses with environmental KPIs, connecting labor rights, connecting business strategy to first-tier suppliers to second-tier suppliers, and saying this is part of your business operations. You will collect this information as part of your everyday work. This is what your business strategy looks like. The third one is a little bit less common, but you're starting to see it in certain templates, which is an auditing or assurance mechanism, which says, We're going to produce a standardized report, and this will be audited by third parties. So you're providing a level of assurance, which homogeneity across these reports is most important, because from site to site, reporting can differ. So how do you compare two sites? How do you sum it up to a company level? And then how do you compare it across companies? And the outcome of these certification schemes, these approaches, is either you get a certificate with a label on it, or you get a standardized sustainability annual report that a lot of large mining companies are starting to produce right now. This is just an example of showing where some of these approaches lie. So from the ICMM to the OECD due diligence guidelines, OECD guidelines for multinationals, what we're seeing is they're a combination of these things. You'll have advice on how to track, you'll have advice on how to manage your systems, you'll have advice on how to report. But where's the issue? The issue right now seems to be a large number of these sustainability approaches are sitting in the advice category or in the guideline category. Very few of them have the capacity to audit and have standardized reporting templates. You see a couple of them, but that large gap means the question of assurance, the question of compliance becomes very difficult for people who are on the other side of this. So where does that leave us? Where are we now and where are we going? My first question is, who really cares about responsible sourcing? For those of us who are actually a part of the responsible sourcing community, we care, obviously, but there is a large community outside of us who want to buy the Tesla, who only want to know if it comes in red or black, who are not concerned whether child labor was involved in the manufacturing of their car battery. So where's the demand for responsible sourcing coming from? And if you think about the economic definition of demand, which is the power to buy and the willingness to buy. There might be willingness to buy, but is there the power to buy? And if there is the power to buy, is there willingness actually to go down this route? And where is the supply of responsible sourcing coming from? Is it coming from the finance sector? Is it coming from the corporates? Is it coming from civil society, which works with ASM? In the larger community where you have willingness and purchasing power, where is the supply and demand of responsible sourcing? Now, the OECD due diligence approach was one of the first that was addressing a very specific raw material responsibility, which was the DRC, which was around cobalt, and it has now morphed into becoming almost the de facto format for a number of responsible sourcing approaches. But something that was developed for something very specific, is it fit for purpose for wider application? The third question that we have is level playing field. How do you ensure the majors, the mid-tiers, the industrial minerals, the small construction mineral sector, how is everybody responsible sourcing? Do we want a level playing field? If we take the top 30 mining companies who account for something like 80% of global metals extraction, is it just good enough that those top 30 companies do it, or do we want everybody to do it? And eventually, are we moving towards responsible sourcing, becoming a competitive edge that allows you to sell on the LME? Or is it going to become the cost of doing business? Is it a way of saying we will be able to access EU markets if we can prove responsible sourcing, or does everybody follow through and we have global acceptance? So how is responsible sourcing approaches evolving? They will continue to evolve by firms. So you've got the big majors, the Anglos and the Rios following through. It will evolve by sector, where the mobility sector, for example, will come up with its own approach to responsible sourcing. And it will happen by geography. Latin America is going to take a different slant to it than Southern Africa, than Western Africa, which is more about gold anyways. But I think one of the shifts that we're going to see is in old, and by old I mean 3 years ago, in old sustainability literature, economic, social, and environmental used to be overlapping circles where there was this mutual ground in the middle, and we said that's where sustainability is. And I think we're going to move now towards saying, no, it's actually one part, it's an entirety. You can't talk about labor rights without looking at environmental rights, without looking at social rights. They all have to come together, and there needs to be a unified approach towards this. And where does that lead us? The area that needs addressing, and a lot has been done, but the areas that need addressing in the near future is the assurance process. How do you audit? Who audits? What qualifications do you need to have for auditing? And I am a cynic, and I do not want to hand auditing over to the big four and then wonder what happened to that auditing process. So what are the assurances that me as a consumer, when I buy something, I assume that there have been regulations and assurances and certification. I no longer need to check where that material came from. I am assured by the government that, well, not the British government, the government that I live under, or the European Union rules or the trade rules, there is a process of assurance where everybody has access to responsibly sourced goods that come from responsibly sourced minerals. And part of that debate then boils down to the third bullet point is, do we homogenize the responsible sourcing process? Is responsible sourcing of minerals, given the diversity of minerals and how they're extracted, do we move towards a system which is exactly the same for everybody who's producing and exporting? Or are we going to see different chains, different kinds of responsible sourcing approaches come out, hoping that they all collectively meet the same end? So is it about means or is it about ends? So the question that I started from, and I argue a lot with my lawyer friends about this, which is compliance with regulations. Have we got a rule book that is acceptable and operational by everyone? And do we have a compliance assurance process that can be picked up widely by a number of people across multiple regions, across global value chains? And as I said, we're starting this project, so we don't have answers. Like any good project, we just have good questions at the moment. And that's all I have to say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Masuma. And you can see all of us behind our muted microphones giving you a fantastic round of applause. That's absolutely brilliant there. Now we've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I can see that some questions are coming in already. But one from my end, which is around your assurance and around where do we get the data from, for example, to actually check up to make sure that what somebody is telling us is the truth. And so that kind of almost secondary verification, because at the moment, the sector seems to rely an awful lot on the data that is reported by the operators. And there's an awful lot of analysis done of those sustainability reports, etc. Are you seeing anybody being able to pull in robust data sets from elsewhere or from other sources to give that secondary verification?
Most of the secondary verification we're seeing right now is coming from civil society actors. Mm-hmm. So you've got people reporting on the environmental journal, Atlas Journal, which sort of says, here are the environmental issues. You've got stories appearing in press, EITI to some extent, but it's not an industry-wide phenomenon. At some point, I had to, for various reasons, read a lot of sustainability reports from mining companies. And I was surprised at the lack of data in there. And then one company to another company, you just could not do a benchmark comparative analysis. You've got people, small consulting firms who are going in and doing third-party audits, but that seems to be around cobalt and the DRC because that's a hotspot. Nobody's doing it around copper or around lithium, for example. The LME's responsible sourcing standards, when they come in, we might see better homogenized reporting right now. But apart from collecting information, one of the issues seems to be what information are you going to collect and what is the metric of that information? And it seems to be a challenge right now. And again, do we all go for the same metrics? Or do we say, right, copper needs to be different, or Latin America needs to be different, and Africa needs to be different? I don't have answers for you, Sarah, unfortunately. I only have more questions.
Questions are always good. They're always good. And so I think, I mean, with that, that's something where on Monday, we of course, we heard from Hugo from the LME, from the London Metal Exchange, and he was describing what is coming over the horizon in the next while, which is great. And also as well, with regards to the secondary verification, on Friday, we've got a number of talks. For example, Gareth's talking about making use of the different satellite sensors to be able to try and keep track of what's maybe going on some of those operations as well. So I think all of this perhaps comes together, which is really nice. I've got one more question for you, if I may, before we then move on to our next speaker. And this one comes in from Nick. And Nick's saying that is one way to assure responsible sourcing to encourage mining in Europe, where norms and procedures can be better monitored than in some other parts of the world. So I think that's an interesting comment. And I think you can maybe, what do you feel about that? What do you think about that?
This is an ambition that Europe has had for a while. And unfortunately, exploration budgets, the level of mining activity in Europe, it's just not going to happen. Europe, either through recycling or through domestic mining production, will not be able to meet its demands. But you also have to remember mining is a very important source of revenue employment in a number of developing countries. So this idea of saying, right, let's just destroy that global value chain and limit it to Europe, I don't think it's a good idea generally in terms of development and promoting transparency. Because remember, mining also brings a lot more to countries. You get transparency, you get revenues, you get how to train people, you get technology transfer. Extraction contributes to development. And I know there are naysayers around that, but don't think the solution is saying, right, we're just going to limit it to the EU 27 because that's the way to do it. I think once you train people and make it a global phenomena, it's a more ambitious and a more worthy cause to go for. And therefore, the answer of limiting it to Europe, yeah, I'm not a big fan of that.
So this is something here where perhaps Nick, Masuma, you guys can take those questions online. I'm sure there's some good debates to be had with regards to that. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your virtual hands together one more time for the wonderful Masuma. Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. Now, Remy, we're about to come to your wonderful self. So if you would like to unmute yourself and begin to share your slides. We're now going to come across to the wonderful Remy, who's dialing in from the USA. Remy is from America's Market Intelligence. And Remy, over to yourself.
Wonderful. Can you hear me? Can you see the slide okay?
We can hear you and we can see your full PowerPoint at the moment. So I don't know if you want to click presentation or feel free to present to us like this.
Remind that I might just go on presentation, but it was interesting to show the little slides. I'm just going to be focusing on 1 or 2 slides maximum. Thank you, first of all, Sarah, for the invitation. I was clearly told that I have to stick within the boundaries of 10:40, and that's that I have to lecture for a very long time. So I'm going to try not to do so. This presentation has been part of it has been presenting with Sarah at a recent webinar on above the ground risks. We actually work, to just try to liaise it with a question from Nick. We actually work in those other areas which is harder to monitor. So we work in Latin America and Africa. I'm based in the US right now, but usually every week in different countries in Latin America and Africa, I'm just discovering a new world where I have to stay far away from the jurisdictions where we work. The angle to which I'm looking at right now is the angle of the rise of criminal organization, especially at the time of COVID-19. In Mexico, we're seeing in Colombia and Brazil, the rise of the activities of criminalized groups that use gold mining specifically for money laundering activities. Right now in north of Mexico, you would have the daughter of El Chapo, which is probably the most well-known drug trafficker, who has her branded masks that she offers to all the communities, and especially next to the gold mining site, to gain some allegiances and gain some influence around mining site. I will take just my perception is that it's not hard to monitor what's going on in Latin America and Africa. Everybody knows what is going on. If you take the time to ask questions, to interview, to get secondary sources, you happen to know which are the properties that actually do a standard and good job of formal and are not played by a criminal organization, which are actually almost a minority. And then you have, to a certain extent, depending on the size of the operations, you have the capacity to see which are the ones that are being played by production and money laundering from production from criminal organization and different types of trafficking, whether it's human trafficking or drug trafficking. Our approach to this, what we do is that we do counterparty risk assessments and due diligence ahead of an acquisition from a mining major or from an investor. We do a lot of on the ground. We have a network of 300 people in Latin America, a little less in Africa, that we activate for a specific expertise, where it is drug trafficking, or it is criminal organization, it is different type of criminal organizations, or also general different types of above the ground risks. And that's a white paper that we published, but I just want this conceptual license. I'm conceptualized differently. I'm not claiming the right conceptualization of it. We actually looked at 7 categories of the ground risk. And obviously for this one, I'm going to be focusing on safety and security, trying to look at what is the relationship between criminal organizations and regular formal mining organizations, and how these influences or these interference can be understood, can be monitored, and then can be mitigated. And that's why you're going to see I'm going to rush directly to the safety and security slide. Have you seen that past one on local community? And we could have actually addressed this issue of sustainable supply from the angle of local community management. But here, my topic is just looking at this issue. When we say security and safety, not specifically operational, we'll look at it from how unsecure levels of security concerns will impact the right development of mining operations. So on this one, for example, as I mentioned, the influence of organized criminal groups that target mining operations to extort monies out of them. We've seen several of those cases in Venezuela. We see them in Colombia and Brazil, and it's the capacity of extortion and influence depends on what is the power game around mining communities, and what is the relationship that the mining company has with local political actors, local economic actors, and often regional actors, because the bridge that you have with regional actors, whether it's the governor or these other economic actors at the regional level, usually provides more influence or strength to try to limit the presence of criminal organizations and try to limit their capacity to try to extort money from you or influence your operations. We've seen countless operations where there's been threats from criminal organization to say, look, you know what, ahead of your smelter, you can actually continue processing your own production, but we're just going to be filling in a certain amount of ounces in terms of our own extraction, and we demand that you actually process it at the same time, and then with a series of bribes down the road, you can actually keep it under cover, and that's how you actually put in jeopardy a sustainable supply chain of mineral in that action. The way that you can absolutely actually do it is obviously with policing forces and military forces, but there's a caveat here in the sense that depending on the jurisdictions where you operate, whether it's Durango, Sinaloa, it is Antioquia next to Medellin, Colombia, there are different actors that you want to integrate into your securitization of operation. Sometimes you want to go through a private third parties of security forces because most of the local institutional actors are being already compromised, and therefore they are being compromised by criminal organizations. Or you might want to have, in the case where you have to get support from local political actors, and you have to go through the traditional formal route of policing your concession, then you want to go through institutional actors of security. But you have to always have a certain level of protocols that make you allow to mitigate the risk that potentially working with compromised forces, because they've been already, let's say, extorted, or they're under the influence of criminal organization, has its limitation. The second element I wanted to mention specifically is the issue of illegal mining interests. And that's why we see, usually, to be oversimplistic, we see different options in terms of address illegal miners or informal mining concession. The first one is usually to police on your concession, put a fence around it, and saying, whatever inside my concession is going to be dealt by my security forces, whatever is outside is going to be dealt by my CR team. And there's usually a lack of communication between the two. The issue here is that there is a risk about antagonizing informal miners and just pushing them away, and basically saying, until you're formalized, you don't have the capacity to work with us and maybe work on a specific deal between informal miners and the concession owner. And I can actually give more details on this. But the problem, if you do that, is basically way into more into the hands of the criminal organizations. The best option usually to do, and although it's actually taking much more, let's say, a little more financial efforts, but much more time. And on this, always on above the ground risk, mining companies believe it's a question of money. It's not a question of money. It's a question of time, dedication, working with empathy, and understanding the concerns of the population. It is the same thing here for informal miners, and the potential benefits of formalizing those informal miners, bringing them, accepting their presence on the concession, which has a cost, but limiting their operations is obviously some areas where reserves might be less promising, might be more interesting nearer to the surface when they can actually access it, but obviously they will not compromise a deeper reserves of minerals. Is a way to go by making sure that they also follow a certain level of environmental regulations, that they follow a certain code of ethics in terms of how they operate on the concession. But that actually usually brings you to having those informal miners as being your own fence towards criminal organization, meaning that because you actually treated them, respectfully and try to give them a perspective of how you formalize them. It's actually very complicated, of course, because usually informal miners are not 9 to 5 kind of, 9 to 5 kind of people. I'm not going to stereotype them, but there's, money burns and is really being spent in different ways just after finding gold, or being able to actually get the money from it. So there's a lot of work of education and trying to be able to put them inside process of that are closer to the traditional formal ways of mining. But if it is done, in a good way, in a midterm to long term, they will become your own protection towards criminal organization. That the port of entry to a community, which is all for informal miners, will side company rather with the criminal actors, because they also know of the risks of working with criminal actors. They usually more money if they're being well formalized. The time of COVID-19 right now is exceptional to encourage for formalization of activities, because if you're not formal, if you don't exist, in fact, then you will not get any kind of support from whether the state, the governorship, to the alcaldía, the township. And although a lot of this support will be limited, there is a push towards being part of those of this formalization process, because you are accounted for. If there's a health issue specifically, there will be you'll be addressed to, and you will actually be part of the process to try to recover any kind of pandemics. There's a push there. That's why we believe it's very important to continue, despite the cut of budgets, continue formalizing those informal miners and not antagonize them. It costs less money, police, the concession, to push away any kind of people that can disrupt normal operations of the mine, especially in terms of COVID-19, that you don't want to compromise it with other people coming from outside. So the tendency of large offense, really this will cost you in the long run. Another element, obviously, which is important, is guerrilla and civil warfare. So, like blood diamonds, but when looking at gold, if it's actually being coming from different regions where you have paramilitary activity. I'm thinking about Bolivar or Nariño in Colombia. I'm thinking about a series of areas in northern Brazil where you have some local guerrillas and guerimperos. I'm thinking about a bunch of different African countries. Sorry, I had too long to list them. But the idea here is really to work, hand in hand with the government to try to put mining as one of the pillars for negotiation of peace talks. What do I mean by this? Obviously, peace talks is not based only on the interest of mining, but just to try to raise to the attention that mining or oil, when it comes to Middle Eastern terrorist groups or others, are the main source of funding of their activity. So if you want to securitize and make sure that the peace has a chance, or at least an improvement of this conflict, the mining and reserves, and the gold reserves especially, or diamond reserves, become suddenly a strategic asset that you need to securitize first. And by doing this, then you actually are able to delimitate clearly which are the areas that will be considered as sustainable source of supplies, as opposition to other areas that might be more compromised with the operation of guerrillas and paramilitary groups. But often in case, those mining interests that can be at times, in the hands of, concessions of junior miners in the civil Canada, but usually interests, a lesser influence into the defining of what could be the military strategy to a series of territory, in the sense that usually they're more influenced by a whole, wealthy family or local political actor that will have an influence of the defense forces towards one direction and not into account a foreign investment in the mining sector. That's why there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that this idea of securitization of concession is one of the priorities, so that you can actually clarify, for us, the sustainable supply sources, but also you can cut down the source of funding for potential guerrillas groups. So I just wanted to, just between organized ground, guerrillas, and illegal mining, informal mining interests, those are three elements that compromises the sustainable supply chains. And there are some best practices to address them from different properties. And then I will answer more questions down now. If not, I'm going to continue talking forever.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that fantastic overview there, Remy. And yep, we're all giving you a round of applause from behind our microphones around the world. Just as these questions come in, and I can see there's some really interesting chatter that's going on here, you describe incredibly complex situations that obviously have the potential to change really, really quickly. Are you seeing any of those different aspects you mentioned just now changing really fast as a result of COVID-19?
So there's two things. First of all, and I didn't know you were going to end the question with COVID-19. I was, more the evolution before COVID-19, because still, recent. We've seen a clear interest both from mining majors, but also investors, in terms of understanding the potential security risk, obviously, which is the compromise on the production, but taking from a different angle, and more of reputation. And that is more in line potentially with issues of making sure that supply chains remain sustainable and uncompromised. It's not a question of volumes, okay, or profit margin. It's a question of a series of different issues as taken precedence on international agenda, in the news. I mean, my best allies, to be honest with you, are the anti-mining interests. My best allies are the green NGOs, anti-mining interests that will raise these issues. And then obviously there's ways to make the case that mining is actually building towards value creation and that supports from the actors, but they forced investors to look much more closely at how compromised some of their the activities that their fund are. So that not only goes into sustainable supply chains, but it's much more into of drug trafficking, environmental concerns, and others. But in there is potentially being linked with criminal organization or criminal states. I mean, we were probably, I don't want to claim too long, but we were part of the reason why Barrick didn't go to Venezuela to start with, because that would have been a terrible idea. And that's a clear example of how, they would have been kind of the supply for a large group would have been by tainting an legitimate regime, one that takes money as a way to finance, criminal activity in the country. That's why we've seen this shift. In terms of COVID-19 on this, we do see a shift which is actually more negative, unfortunately. COVID-19 impact on developing countries' jurisdictions is more seen from population because of the incapacity of states to actually react to it and provide security or masks or any kind of clear protocol or health support to the population. That's actually not as bad as people think in terms of hospitals. Infrastructure is there, but obviously in remote areas, which is where usually mining sites are locating. In remote areas, that's where you have less so of social infrastructure. And in recent years, unfortunately, mining companies that use their CSR budget for larger infrastructure, such as let's say roads or electricity, which makes sense, but as it has helped the state, or maybe it's not the role of the company, but have hospitals or schools from time to time because it's popular, but that must be left on the side. And the issue is the lack of from communities where the criminal organization are stepping in, whether it's like Camora in Italy, in every country, seeing like a stepping up of criminal organization that say, well, the state is not here for you. By the way, I do have those liquidities for your business. Shady liquidities. It's called money laundering, but you can continue working. So we are very much concerned about the staggering rise in security risk, especially among local communities, informal mining communities around mining sites. And that's why we are spend our time just calling our partners saying, don't decrease, don't, continue with your team, continue with communication through radio, through something, but just don't move away from communities because while there's COVID-19, you have your corporate protocols and others, because the criminal organization, they do not care about social distancing, or maybe just, coming at 2 meters is fine. There's protocols from companies that do not come out of site, or they should stay at home. And at the end of the day, there's a vacuum where criminal organizations are really taking advantage of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Remy. I think what we're seeing here, actually, there are a number of questions that are coming in on the Q&A. So what I'll invite you to do is maybe begin to address some of those offline, but maybe just 30 seconds on you mainly focus on Latin America, I guess, with regards to the risks and the case studies that you shared. Are there any comparisons that can be made either with Europe or with Africa, for example, with regards to some of those key risks?
So, let's say 75% or 80% of our work's in Latin America, and we've been there for 30 years. We fairly, we newer, let's say, in Africa, and we do a little bit of work in North America. We're not in Europe. But anyway, I can still answer it from maybe less concrete experience, but there are clear differences between Latin America and Africa. Mainly on the structure of the countries. That's the political science professor speaking here, right? But the structure of the countries, the way that national actors work with regional actors or local actors, the same way.
I think we may have lost Remy. It's because he's in Miami where the sun is shining. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to just stop Remy where he is at the moment. And Karen, and you will noted that Remy is in part answering your question, as well as Katrina as well. I think Remy's coming across and answering some of the European aspects there. We'll allow him to answer those online instead of doing it verbally. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move swiftly along to Insia, who is in Wales, which is a bit closer to home than Miami. So let's hope that the Welsh Wi-Fi is better than the Miami Wi-Fi. So Insia, I don't know if you...
That is debatable.
Brilliant. So you've proven that you can come off mute, and I relinquish all control over to your wonderful self. And so if you want to share your slides, etc., if you bring them up on the screen now. And Insia is actually going to, it's a really nice segue from what Remy was describing, because of course, some of the solutions to a lot of what we've been hearing about is of course the stakeholder engagement. So Insia, I don't know if you want to click slides with regards to your presentation as a whole, just to make them a bit larger on the screen. There we go. Perfect. Over to yourself.
Is that good?
That is perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Sarah. I'm going to be looking at the future of stakeholder engagement and looking at what the drivers are of change. So I'm going to briefly look at how stakeholder engagement has been approached by companies historically and persistent challenges to the way in which it has been approached. I'll then look at a number of factors that are driving a change in stakeholder engagement processes. And then I'll look at what companies are moving towards in terms of stakeholder engagement processes and what these processes will look like more and more in the future. So historically, companies rarely perceive themselves as agents of social change, with a common practice being for companies to relegate social issues to their philanthropy department or their CSR, corporate social responsibility department. This perpetuated the separation of social issues from core operations and strategy. Persistent challenges to stakeholder engagement have included failure to identify the right stakeholders, perhaps through a process of mapping according to level of influence and importance. Actually, I'm just going to give a quick definition of stakeholders, which they're usually defined as an individual, group, or entity that has an interest in a company and its activities, may be affected by them, or can have an effect on them. So just going back to my challenges, the second point is failure to choose the right engagement methods, with little to no consideration given, for example, to the inclusion of vulnerable groups, a lack of effective stakeholder engagement at early stages of exploration and project development, a lack of strategic approach to an adaptive process during the life of mine. If you look at stakeholder engagement as a risk management tool, it requires regular review to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And sometimes, quite often, the case is that a stakeholder engagement plan is developed, but then the case might be that it's not reviewed over time, or it's never looked at again even. No continuous process of engagement. So a few engagements may take place to inform and consult on project activities, for example, but there'll be minimal then ongoing engagement. Failure to provide effective feedback, whether that's on comments made or concerns raised by stakeholders, and a lack of capacity and support for effective stakeholder engagement in terms of human and financial resources and capacity. If you look at the diagram that is on the slide, you have noted some stakeholder groups down. I've also included, or environment's also included as a stakeholder group, and that's because it can be affected by and have an effect on a company and its activities. Essentially, the point is that stakeholder engagement, stakeholder audience, is growing and is driven by purpose and change. And I'll touch upon this again in another slide. So since the SDGs came into the spotlight, there's been the growing appreciation that there's been the growing appreciation that meeting the target set requires the support of the private sector, whether this is in terms of finance or expertise or technological support and research. This acknowledgement has been reflected in increase in interest or discussions or discourse even around impact investment, socially responsible investment, and blended finance as well. So there's the expectation that companies align their community development strategies at achieving social outcomes that mesh with global public priorities. Companies are incorporating these 17 goals into their broader sustainability strategy and producing sustainability reports as well. There's also an investment justification with the growing interest, obviously, as has been discussed by numerous people in this conference, growing interest in ESG from institutional investors in particular to show that companies are investing in solutions, not problems, and pursuing financial success in a way that yields benefits to society. It would be fair to say then that running in parallel and fueling this change at the same time is a growing stakeholder audience who have increasing expectations and are a catalyst for change. There's growing global demand from these stakeholders, whether that's shareholders, consumers, employees, and the wider society, for transparency in the value chain of companies. They expect to see reporting of non-financial information that's reliable, easily understandable, and consistent from companies. And all of this is putting increased pressure then on them. So building on my last point and moving on to drivers of change, we have civil society, firstly thanks to social media. Communities and other stakeholder groups have greater access to information than ever before. About not only the negative consequences of mining, but the positive ones as well. Secondly, there's the online proliferation of information at people's fingertips. This is known as hyper-transparency, and it means that companies have less control over external content and can no longer control the timing or content of information about them that's released. Thirdly, communities are made up, and I think it's quite important to occasionally remind ourselves that a community is not a homogeneous group, but actually made up of individuals with agency. And they have a greater level of awareness and understanding of their rights. They have improved access to NGOs and CSOs to support them. They're demanding more and holding companies to account for not following through on their commitments. That leads me on to my next point about the concept of localization, and to appreciate the importance of local knowledge and solutions to local problems. And linked to this is local content and local content requirements, which are policies imposed by governments that require firms to produce domestically manufactured goods or domestically supplied services. Most mines spend more money on procurement of goods and services than they do on taxes, employee salaries, and community investment combined. So it's quite important to appreciate the massive potential for economic and social development at a local and national level. This does require corporate thinking to move away from seeing communities as beneficiaries and to appreciate the assets that exist in the community as resources for building sustainability. Running parallel to this, and especially in the context of what I've been talking about, as stakeholder and consumer concerns have grown, and with the UN guiding principles as which provide a meaningful framework, supply chain oversight has emerged as a critical corporate priority as well. Another driver is the ongoing discussions at a global level on the need to tackle inequality and to ensure equity and inclusion in interventions in order to reduce poverty. Mining activities have the potential to exacerbate inequalities and to exclude vulnerable groups, but as a driver of development, companies are provided with the opportunity to ensure that gender equality and the inclusion of other vulnerable groups is mainstreamed in their interventions and considered in their activities. At the risk of oversimplification, I've grouped a number of other items and drivers here because they're interconnected, they're systematic, and they create a complex environment to operate in. And for example, climate change, from a very basic humanitarian lens, can expose vulnerabilities, exacerbate inequalities, and add fuel to existing crises. Employee effect. I've added this one as one of the obstacles in the that the industry is facing in terms of either people leaving the industry or attracting new recruits, because there is the acknowledgement that public perception and negative attitudes towards the sector can be changed if the industry demonstrates how it's addressing issues that are of concern to society and stakeholders. When this is ranging from as well. So in terms of what the future of stakeholders is, stakeholder engagement is looking like, what I will say is that there's more consideration given to the purpose and depth of engagement. Transparency is definitely key in this. Hyper transparency means that companies themselves need to be more proactively transparent from the outset. Companies also need to champion transparency through substantive engagement by tackling difficult and often neglected topics such as mine closure or social transitioning. It's important for companies together with stakeholders to begin with the end in mind, which is the case, which in this case is future sustainability of mining communities. For this reason, engagement with a particular group of stakeholders, whether it's communities, local government, needs to take a step beyond, simply ticking a box to looking at objectives of equality, sustainability, and shared values as well. And I just want to link to this the idea that it needs to be rights-led. It needs to go simply beyond informing them about the project and having a one-off consultation with them. It needs to, one of the other things that I want to mention is an increasing consideration by governments to undertake either a human rights impact assessment or a gender impact assessment, which gives the opportunity for project impacts to be looked at through a human rights lens or a gender lens. And both of them require extensive and meaningful stakeholder engagement with specific groups that are inherently inclusive. Building partnerships is a way of addressing the complex and systematic challenges that I mentioned in the previous slide. For example, stakeholder climate change, or an increase in extremism, for example, or the issue of human rights. And it needs to be transformational by looking at the broader environment. So perhaps rather than looking only at direct stakeholders, also consider indirect stakeholders. And the other thing, which I won't touch on for too long, is that it's all about early engagement, and it was talked about quite a lot actually by in a presentation yesterday, and the importance of engagement at exploration stage and the benefits that they can bring in terms of the future development of the mine. And just quickly on my last point, I just want to emphasize that it's not easy. Effective stakeholder
We're being lucky today with the internet. I'm going to give her another few seconds. Are you back? Yes, you're back. Fantastic. Keep going.
Oh, I finished. Where did you get to?
Your last point.
How have I didn't, I was a little bit panicky during it because I thought I'd lost the internet connection. Sorry. My last point was how stakeholder engagement of the future is not necessarily going to be easy because things to consider are that it's expensive, it takes time, it requires a continuous process. That was it, actually.
Beautiful. Thank you very, very much. And well done for getting to the end there. So massive round of applause from all of us behind our microphones. And we do have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay, Insia. Is that okay for us to ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, hopefully my internet will be okay.
Yeah, so, well, if not, I can take a go at trying to answer some of them, which would be a disaster for everybody. But the first question that we have for you that comes from Jane, and what she asks is, what kind of methods are there to demonstrate good stakeholder engagement?
That's a good question. Well, I think the easy answer to that is the evidence or the maintaining of a social license. Well, that's the easy answer. A more detailed one would be, well, as long as there is sufficient data management in terms of the stakeholder engagement and sufficient record keeping, there'll be qualitative and quantitative information that can be looked at, such as how many engagements have taken place, whether there's been effective remediation of any concerns or grievances raised, the extent and the variety of stakeholders that are being engaged with. And on another level, another thing that would be interesting to look at in terms of how effective it's been is what was the purpose of the engagement in the first place. So if they have effective monitoring and evaluation to see how effective community development programs have been, for example, and what kind of change in impact indicators, what the change in that has been. So evidence of that as well.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And one final question, if I may, and this comes from Sandra. And Sandra asks or says, in my country, there is a strong movement against mining that is not necessarily that easily understandable. They have said that they don't accept the word stakeholder. Is there any other approach, or is there any other place with this kind of feeling?
Is there any other examples where there has been a rejection of the term?
Yes, yeah.
No, not that I'm aware of, but I guess I would have a question in response to that, and that's whether, so I guess a clarification would be good, is whether they reject being identified as stakeholders or whether they reject the definition of a stakeholder.
Yeah, and this is something here. So I think Sandra makes a really good point, and there are lots of other words that are used instead of stakeholder. And so, for example, in a lot of the ISO standards, you now see interested party instead of the word stakeholder.
Yeah, that's quite often used, interested and affected parties.
Yeah. So this is something here where, thank you so much, Insia. That was absolutely fantastic. Apologies for your internet. I'm sure it will perk up
it was fine all the way through, I felt, until it was the time for my presentation.
But brilliant, thank you very much. And if we could all put up our hands together on our sides of the microphones to say thank you very much for a brilliant talk from yourself. Brilliant. Okay, if you can just stop sharing your slides now, that would be brilliant. And we're now going to go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and all of Canada to Vancouver. And we're going to now come to Nadia, who is going to talk to us about some of the research that she's been doing in her area. As you can see here, Nadia is an expert on all things water, and she is going to describe to us some of the ins and outs with regards to progressing water security in mining regions. So Nadia, over to yourself.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you to Sarah and Rose, and also to Ollie for inviting me to come and speak today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of my work with many of you in all different corners of the world, and I'm really great that we can still connect in the uncertain times in which we find ourselves at the moment. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference here in Vancouver, and one of the keynote speakers got up, and he was a CEO of a major mining company, and he made a really profound statement, which was that he said mining companies are not only in the business of mining, but they're also in the business of water. And for those of us who work in water, you know, this was a great thing to hear from someone so senior, but it also speaks to just how important water is becoming at all different levels of the organization. And so some follow-up work that company Goldcore had been doing on the amount of water that the company was moving relative to how much ore they were moving was really substantial. And as you can see from that first kind of quote that I've got there, you know, in some cases at some of their operations, they were moving up to 15 times the volume of water as what they were ore. So clearly the importance of being good water managers is very, very important in the business of mining. And in areas that are more water scarce, we also have different kinds of water problems. And I like to think that no matter which mine you visit in the world, there's going to be some kind of water problem, whether that's quantity in terms of shortage, whether that's flooding, or if it's quality issues or other. And as the quote there on the bottom right is also highlighting, you know, water-related infrastructure can in some cases be a very, very significant part of capital expenditure for some projects. And so the importance of water is clearly something that is very much top of mind for a number of companies. But in more recent years, I've been very lucky to be engaging with a lot of excellent colleagues, including Jocelyn Fraser, who works in stakeholder engagement. And this work has kind of exposed me to the different ways that we can think about water-related risks from the perspective of different actors. And so a lot of my work has kind of started to broaden beyond just thinking about company water risk to thinking about how risk is perceived differently by different people. And a couple of years ago, a lady called Diarra Kemp and some of her colleagues at the University of Queensland published an excellent paper where they were talking about the way in which the word social risk is becoming conflated in mining. And so whether we're talking about social risk from the perspective of communities or from the perspective of a company, the word social risk can have different meanings. And I would argue that it's very similar when we think about water. So we can think about water risk from the perspective of a mining project, and the pictures on the left there highlight some of the different ways that water risks can pose impacts to production. So whether that be through flooding, like the $1 billion production losses that happened several years ago in Queensland, or issues associated with water quality and flotation and how that needs to be actively managed. On the right-hand side, though, of course, we have water risks to people and to community and to environment associated with mining's use of water. So we think of issues like water quality, acid rock drainage causing a lot of legacy issues for projects, and of course the health impacts that can happen in relation to the interaction that happens between people and between water in mining, and that particular picture is from artisanal mining, of course. And when we think about the large-scale mining sector and the relationship that companies have with social issues around water, where we look at incidents of social conflict, actually water is very often right at the center of that. And as you can see from that picture down the bottom, you know, this can sometimes erupt in very violent conflict. And so the potential for water-related issues to really rebound to a company can be really substantial. And so I think when we think about water, we really do need to be cognizant of the different ways in which we can think about those impacts. And this slide I know is very busy, so don't panic. It's a lot of data there, but I really just wanted to highlight some of the key trends that these charts show. And this is some really interesting work that was done by some Australian researchers who were looking at Australian data, but they found very similar things from a lot of studies in other parts of the world. And so the picture on the left-hand side is showing that average ore grades are declining in many different parts of the world, and particularly for many different commodities. And that's probably not a surprise for many of us who are working in the mining sector. But the picture in the middle also highlights that as we start to have lower ore grades, and as we move to the left-hand side of that figure, we can see that the water consumption is going up per tonne of product. So as we're mining lower ore grades, unless we have significant changes in the way that we're processing ore and that we're producing ore, we're also going to result in an increase in water consumption and energy consumption as well for the amount of product that we're producing. And of course, if we're mining lower ore grades, that also means we have to dig a lot more rock out in order to produce our product. And as a consequence of that, and as you can see from the right-hand side, that we're also going to be generating more waste. So both in terms of waste rock, but also in terms of tailings. So these images are really just to highlight that water issues will by all intents, be likely to get more challenging as we move forward. And that's part of the reason why I think we really need to be very, cognizant of the ways in which water issues are addressed, and also the close relationship between water and waste is another area of interest for me in particular. So I hold a research chair at UBC, and my research, I kind of have been thinking about it in two dimensions. I hold half of my appointment in the School of Mining Engineering, and in the work that I do in that realm, I would say is mainly focused on the risks to mining projects. So the left-hand side there, working at the engineering and the business interface, and I'll give some examples of what I mean when I talk about that in terms of understanding how we can mitigate the ways in which water can pose a risk to mining business and operations. But on the right-hand side, I'm also really interested in how we think about water issues within regions, what water issues can arise for people and for communities, for ecosystems that are located within regions where we have mining. And so that part of my research, I have another hat where I have half of my appointment in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. And so I feel very privileged to be working in this very interdisciplinary world at a university. And so that's been really great to expose me to different ways of thinking about these issues and when we think about water in particular. And increasing as my work's evolved, I've also started to realize that actually there's other kinds of actors that are thinking about water. So like investors, how do they see risks to portfolios? And that's an evolving area of work, which I'll also touch on briefly today. 10 minutes goes very quickly, by the way, so I'll just be giving you a high-level summary of things that hopefully will spark your interest to follow up with me. And so my research team is really international. It's interdisciplinary. As you'll see from the picture, we work in all different parts of the world. And whenever I'm doing a project in another country, I always endeavour to have a student from that country as well. And we have in particular been doing a lot of really exciting work in Mongolia in recent years, which I can talk more about in the question time. But as you can see, we have a lot of interest in Latin America as well. And so when I started my work in this space and when I first went to work in water and mining about 15 years ago, one of the things that really struck me when I was visiting a lot of mine sites is that not all of them would necessarily have a water balance. And we've seen that improve substantially in recent years. And I think, on account of a lot of the water-related effects that a lot of mining companies faced, there's much more recognition of the need to manage a water balance and to have good water accounting practices. And a lot of the work that's been led from the Mineral Council of Australia and ICMM has led to a lot of improvements in the way water reporting happens. And we certainly see increasingly when I visit sites, I anticipate that they will have some kind of water balance. But one of the things that I've been doing in a lot of my work with mining projects is to actually make sure that we're able to communicate information about risk to different levels of the organization. And often what can happen sometimes with water is because it's kind of not always prioritized until it's really critical, unfortunately, which means that we really need to develop models that can speak to higher levels of management and explain why we need to have have really strong water management practices. So a lot of the models I've developed in my previous work have been really focused on having this systems level view of water to communicate what those risks, particularly around water quantity, look like. And as I'm moving this work forward, I've just got a new PhD student, Benjamin Cox, who has a background in finance, and we'll be doing a lot of work also looking at how to put a financial value on some of the technologies you might implement in order to improve water management. And so that's really important for getting the right attention of the right person to make investments in water. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight on this picture is on the right-hand side. This is some work I did in my PhD where I was looking at social networks to look at who people talk to about water. And it was really fascinating to me. We know that there's a lot of operational silos at a lot of sites, but when I went to actually map this out for a case study, it was really striking when we came back with these network maps, which really highlighted how divided some of the communication can be around water. So this picture shows dots with each individual represented by a circle. The size of the dot is a level in the organization. And what you can see is that between the two largest production departments, they're not communicating with one another about water. And groups like health and safety were the ones in the middle that play a really important role in bridging that communication. So this is just to kind of touch on how some of my research in the past has kind of touched on these risks to projects. And I have a lot of ongoing work in this space, including with another student of mine, Alice, who'll be continuing to build on some of this previous work. Another area of work that we've been focusing on is also thinking about risks to people. And I mentioned that I've had some really great collaborators who are much more experienced in stakeholder engagement and community engagement than I am. And that's been a fascinating learning experience for me. But one of the things we've been endeavoring to do in some recent work is how do we actually get engineers to think about risks to people and communities in the way that they're doing their decision making. And so this particular project that I've highlighted here is also with some collaborators from the University of Queensland, and they had a model that was looking in the Chilean context around how to optimize infrastructure for different mines that were located in inland regions of Chile. And as many of you who may know a little bit about Chilean mining is that a lot of the mines are up in the Atacama in the mountains. So in some cases, and it's actually being encouraged actively for companies to be using desalinated water for mining projects, which means that water is being pumped from the sea up to the mountains at a very high energy cost. So there's been some really interesting work done on the water and energy trade-offs around that. But what's less well studied is the ways in which communities are also impacted by this desalination infrastructure. And so what we've been doing is taking that model that's looked at water and energy trade-offs and thinking, how can we actually also incorporate community impacts and community costs into the way we do our modelling? So that's another key area of work that we've been doing in recent times. And then just finally to touch on, because I know that I'm probably running out of time, as I said, I am also becoming aware that there are other actors that have an interest in thinking about risk from their perspective. And so I have a new PhD student, Sally, who's been working with me for the last year. And one of the things that's happened recently around tailings, and of course, tailings and water are very closely connected, which I'm happy to expand more on. But this call for transparency around tailings management in particular has been really very influential in recent times and very clear. So many of you will have heard about the Church of England and other investors coming together to encourage more transparency around tailings data. What she's actually done in the early stages of her research was to do interviews with investors to better understand how they feel they play a role in reducing tailings risk, and also what they need in terms of information to make better decisions. And she did a series of interviews with investors in the early stages of her research. And what she found is that a lot of these initiatives like the tailings disclosure request, they have a lot of positive benefits, but at the same time, there are investors that aren't quite sure how they're going to use that data for information. So the next stage of her research is now looking at how we can model a lot of those tailings locations to develop tools that may be helpful for investors to better understand risk exposure. And so we have some really interesting collaborations with our Earth Science group who have some very funky models that we're working with to look at what the consequences of failure events could be. And then we'll also be aiming to get at likelihood quantification going forward. So in summary, and just to wrap up, I just wanted to highlight, you know, that as I've gone on this journey of mind water over my career, I've certainly become to appreciate that when we think about water risk, we really need to have different lenses, because there are many different actors that consider this term and they think of it very differently. Water risks are growing. I would say that we need to have increased attention and ongoing attention to water issues. And finally, that I really do feel an interdisciplinary approach is so important for looking at water issues. And I'm incredibly grateful to the wonderful team of students that I work with. As I said, I've only touched extremely briefly on some of our work today. I encourage you to get in touch. We also, just a little advertisement, Benjamin and I, he actually initiated a mineral processing economics course, which we've been running online for the last several weeks. So if anyone's interested, connect with me on LinkedIn and I can share the details with you. But thank you so much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now so that we can come back to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nadia. So round of applause from our sides of the microphones, and you will see all of the other people on video there all applauding you as well. That was brilliant. And yes, please, with regards to sharing the details to your course, I'm sure there'll be lots of people who will be interested in that. Now, there has been a plethora of comments and questions. There's been a massive debate whilst you were talking around stakeholder.
Okay.
As well as, of course, people talking about water as a whole. And I think before we go to some of those questions, was there something that you wanted to talk about with regards to your team in Mongolia and what they were doing? Because you skipped through them really fast.
I did. I just touched. Well, actually, I guess I was thinking about it because we've actually been working over the last kind of 2 or 3 years with an early stage exploration project operating in Mongolia. And so my colleague Jocelyn has been focusing more on the stakeholder engagement piece, actually, and thinking about the role of exploration in the early stages. So we've got some reports that that we can share on that. I'm happy to kind of flick them on. I'll add a link in the chat there. But also in terms of water, I think we really need to consider the kind of the role of early stage exploration in making good decisions about water, because water issues are, you know, the way that we make decisions on water very early has a lot of implications for other stages of the mine life cycle as well. So I think thinking about the dependencies between stages of life is really important in relation to water.
Yeah, and this is something I know that, so we've got Norman Gridley speaking later on today, and in a previous life he was in charge of sustainability and risk management for Quellaveco, so one of the big copper mining projects in Peru. That was one of the key risks there was, of course, water, because it's in a very dry part of the world. But with that, so I guess many of the risks that we think about is the availability or the access to water. But what about the quality of water? And this builds on some of the information that Pierre from the Responsible Mining Foundation shared with us on Monday, where lots of people focus on, is there water there? But then actually trying to delve into all of those aspects of the quality of the water is a bit more difficult. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think issues, it's interesting because I do see, you know, well, I always like to tell my students, it doesn't matter where in the world you go, there's going to be a water problem. No matter which mine you visit, there'll be some kind of water issue. And so scarcity is one that I think is really top of mind. We think about security of supply, but actually, you know, I've seen some really interesting presentations from companies that will say, you know, it's not about scarcity for us. The majority of sites actually have flooding risk. For us, it's more about managing the volumes of water. And so, and from communities, a lot of communities may be more worried about the legacy impacts around water and the water quality issues around mining than what they necessarily, you know, so their perception of risk can be very different as well. So I do think we need to think a bit broader when we think about what we mean by water risk. And it's certainly not just about scarcity risk at all. The other thing I'll say, and it's another area of work that another one of my students, Gabrielle, is working on is, and he's actually from Peru. So he's very interested in mines located in mountainous areas and what the impacts of climate change will pose on people and ecosystems around those projects. So I think, you know, the impacts of climate change are another dimension to this, which will kind of intensify a lot of those challenges for mining as well. And quality plays very much into that in terms of legacy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nadia. And we've just had a new question that's come in from Christopher, and he's asking, have you looked at tailings and water recycling at all?
Tailings and water recycling together. So I suppose, you know, a lot of, like, so I'm not a geotechnical tailings person. There are people that focus on that, but certainly in terms of tailings being a key area for opportunity in terms of water savings, absolutely. And a lot of the risks that, tailings failure events, for example, excess water in a tailings dam can be one of several triggers that can lead to failures. So there's a very close relationship between the way that you manage water on a site and what that means in terms of tailings risk. And also the thinking about where there are opportunities to save water. Very often the water that, often a lot of sites, particularly mines that I've worked with in the Australian context, when we looked at their water balances, the water opportunities to save water by recycling from tailings are often the biggest opportunity. So once water goes to tailings, the only place it goes is up or down. So it either gets entrained in the waste or it gets evaporated. And so that's kind of lost water. So from the perspective of trying to save water and recycle more water, tailings is a huge opportunity. So technologies to recycle water from tailings can also be extremely important to think about, particularly for sites in water scarce areas. But as I said, because of the risks of storing too much water and potential flooding, I would say that we still also need to have attention to water management, even if we're in wet areas as well.
Brilliant. And one more question that we will squeeze in here for you. And this comes through from Andy. And Andy's asking, he says, he's very interested in your network diagrams and asks, how do we address challenges if organizations don't talk to each other? Are there some really basic things that need to be put in place here?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think I might have to, I know Andy well, I might have to follow up with him on that one. I think there are, the whole space of how to break down silos is really key, and it's a big topic. So, to give, I guess the easiest, to give a very quick answer, I would say we do need to think about the role that brokers play in communication, trying to position people in strategic ways to promote communication. I think sometimes we undervalue the role that these facilitators can play in making sure communication flows within organizations. There are very good reasons why we have departments. They have a lot of important functions for ensuring people can get their work done, but we also really need to value brokers. We need to value people that can cross those silos also.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yes, his question is in the Q&A, so feel free to answer him with some more in-depth details, and the rest of us can all see those as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Round of applause from all of us around the world. And next, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come from Vancouver all the way back to the UK, and the wonderful Andrew Bloodworth is going to speak for us next. So Andrew, if you'd like to just come off mute and then begin to share your slides for us here. There we go. So he's just getting his slides up and running. So as we can see here, so Andrew, as he's going into the presentation mode.
Okay.
Yep, it's just coming through now. That's absolutely glorious. There we go. Andrew, rather than take up any more of your time, I'm going to hand straight across to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Fantastic event this, quite amazing, really. So I'm going to talk about, sort of zoom out a bit from the previous talks and talk about a sort of very high level thing that might be blindingly obvious to those of us in the geoscience community that work with extractives, particularly with minerals. And this is about what the world outside our community thinks about our business, and particularly the massive concern that is shown by some groups, and this is the media, the public, policymakers, and other scientists, about geological stocks and the fact that we're going to run out. So, and this has been around for quite a long time. People like Thomas Malthus, the political economist, who first wrote about resources. He was talking mainly about agricultural resources in the 18th century, and then the Victorians with Jevons. Then in the 20th century, after the Second World War, the President Eisenhower's Material Policy Commission. And then I'm afraid old enough to remember the publication of Limits to Growth in the 1970s. All of these the publications that came out of these pieces of work made dire predictions about us running out of mineral resources of one sort or another. And then that sort of went away for a bit. And then in the millennium, it all came back again. And we got this sort of neo-Malthusian thinking about resources, what I've called depleted thinking about mineral exhaustion. Famously in David Cohen's article in New Scientist in 2007, when he calculated that we were going to run out of all sorts of things in the next 100 years. Our own august institution, the Geological Society of London, published an article called Limits to Growth Revisited in 2015, which made the same sort of predictions. And just last year, our colleagues in the Royal Society of Chemistry started a campaign called Elements in Danger, and I drew attention to the strapline under Elements in Danger. Did you know that your mobile phone contains at least 30 different naturally occurring elements? Natural sources of 6 of these are set to run out within the next 100 years, with several more under rising threat from increased use. Now, those of us working in this area know that this is simply not true. We are not going to run out of things in the next 100 years. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. But we see again and again in the media, again, as I say, from other scientists, from some august scientific journals, and from politicians, phrases like peat metal, elements in danger, getting rarer, reserves are dwindling. And they all compound this long-standing myth about the imminent depletion of minerals and metals. And we would contend, myself and my fellow authors, Paul Lusty and Mike Stevenson, that these assumptions are mainly rooted around misunderstanding of what resources and reserves are. And I'm not going to tell this audience what a resource and reserves are, but there are some working definitions that you could use if you like. They really are economic definitions, not physical definitions. And that's what the community of people outside our community really, really misunderstand. So those terms used by other scientists, the media, other people are frequently, generally used incorrectly. And our colleagues in the USGS give some good guidance on this. They say reserves are dynamic, and failure to appreciate this dynamic nature leads to erroneous forecast, because our friends and colleagues outside our community tend to look at a reserve figure and they do what we call a static lifetime calculation. They divide the quoted mineral reserve by the current or projected mineral consumption, and you end up with a number of years left. But we all know that resources and reserves are economic entities. They're working inventories that are only valid at a given time. And they vary according to the rate of extraction, new discoveries, plus a whole bunch of factors that you've been hearing about this week around the politics, the social, economic, and technical factors, which affect the economic viability of those particular reserves and resources. And they are absolutely not a reliable indicator of future availability of minerals and metals. And if you ever wanted a diagram that shows that, this is a conflagration of data from our colleagues in the USGS, which is their reserves data, with my colleagues here in BGS in the UK who monitor world mine production of copper. And you can see there the grey bars are reserves from the USGS, and the copper colored line is world mine production. And you can just see there how reserves have just kept pace. And you can plot just about every other metal, and it shows a similar sort of graph. And those of us working in this business know that and know that's true. So we know that the Earth's total endowment is much greater than current mineral resource and reserve estimates indicate. And we know that we will find more. There are undiscovered identified deposits. There are more exploration around known deposits. And really critically importantly, there are massive resources and reserves, or resources particularly at the moment, within the secondary and within our own environment, within the anthropogenic environment, that we will be able to recover as our economy becomes more circular. So you might say, so what? Well, we believe this is important because we're not, this is a distraction. This constant obsession in the media and in other groups around running out is a distraction from the real issue. The real issue is environmental limits, not physical exhaustion. So we're much more concerned that planetary environmental limits are being pressed by mineral and metal production. And there's some scary figures out there around primary metal production accounts for about 20% of global industrial energy use, or about 7 to 8% of total global energy use. That's a lot of energy. And therefore that's a lot at the moment greenhouse gases. So we can make some really big reductions in greenhouse gases by looking at the efficiency of mining, particularly the major industrial metals that we mine in quantity. So to finish, the running out stories, as I've called them here, are very appealing. The media love it. The number of times I've been asked, how much have we got left? When are we going to run out, by journalists? It's a pretty standard question. They're very good. They sell clicks and they sell print, but they are a serious distraction from the urgent need to relieve the environmental pressure on the planet. So my appeal to the geologists of you out there is, every time you hear a journalist or someone else talking about reserves wrongly, correct them, please. Tell them that they've got this wrong, because it's a major, major issue, I think. And just to finish, thanks very much. Just today, we published a science briefing paper on this very issue. So if you go to that web address, there it is. And it's literally only been up there 2 hours. So we just got there in time. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Andrew. So round of applause from all of us on our side of the microphones. And just before we come to questions, one question from me. So just to be sure, are you telling us that we're absolutely not running out of all of this? Is that the take home message from you?
I think what I always say to people is, if you think the world's running out of metal, go to the prospectors shack at the PDAC and just see the number of people trying to sell deposits and prospects and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think all the figures suggest that I am not complacent about this. And the previous speaker made the very, very valid point that things are getting harder to get at, and we're consuming more and more energy or water and other environmental impacts in doing that. So that's the issue. The issue isn't the amount of metal in the ground. The issue is the amount of effort it's taking us to get out. So I would argue that we stop worrying about we're going to run out of copper or we're going to run out of cobalt or whatever, and start worrying about what's the environmental impact of that, particularly greenhouse gases, because that's an existential risk facing us, and we need to do something about that. Stop worrying about running out of stuff. I'm not saying we don't need to keep looking, and we don't need to keep doing research, and we don't need to keep investing in all that, but we definitely need to disavow our stakeholders, I'm going to use that term, that of this issue, in theory, yes, the planet is a finite place, but if you think about it, the problem with our impact on the environment is not actually our impact in everybody talks about non-renewable resources. Minerals are a non-renewable resource. That's much less of an issue than our impact on renewable resources like air, like our atmosphere, like water quality, habitat destruction. They're much, much bigger problems for us facing now. That's what we need to focus our effort on.
So thank you for that. Thank you for that, Andrew. Something that maybe just builds on this whole discussion, and you're a brave man using the word stakeholder with regards to the chatter that's going on at the moment. But this is maybe something as well where perhaps words are getting in the way of meaning. And that's the case. So, for example, yesterday we heard from David Payne, who was one of the people involved in the UK minerals strategy. And the interesting thing around that was that's a document that's written more from the planner's perspective. And
yes.
so when we're perhaps seeing the words reserves being used in that document, it's around stocks that are available to the construction industry in the UK, which of course means something very different to somebody who's involved in, say, copper mining in Peru. So is this something here, Andrew, where do you think that when people are saying we're running out, there's an awful lot of misinterpretation and misunderstanding with regards to the words that we're using?
Yeah, I think there is. I think one of the problems is that our community use these words in different ways as well. So we have to be, you know, one of the arguments we make in this paper is to be more precise about definitions and clearer about. And my organization is as guilty as anything else, because we talk about resources all the time, and we don't mean resources in the sense that a lot of our company colleagues talk about resources. So it is very difficult. It's fraught. The semantics in this are very difficult, but I do think that fundamentally there is a problem with people misunderstanding what the issue is for our resource use. It's not about physical exhaustion. It's about the impact, the indirect impact of our resource use on non-renewable resources like the atmosphere, like water, etc. And we really, it really worries us that policymakers, particularly people who make the laws we all have to work by, keep coming back to this. And you know, there's a lot of concern about that, and it's not. We need to really change their view on that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. There are a couple of questions that are coming in, and you're going to have to bear with us in terms of whilst people sort through this whole running out thing. So we need to address these questions. One question here is from Nick, and he asks, I've been told that one element that might run out is helium. Is there any truth in that?
That's the one that does float away if we use it, whereas everything else theoretically doesn't. I mean, I'm not an expert on helium at all. I think it is probably one of those things that we have to be more careful about how we use, but it's the exception rather than the rule, I would thought.
Okay, thank you for that. So hopefully that answers your question, Nick. We've got another question in here that says we're actually running out of cheap metals. Whereas high grade deposits seem to decrease within world production. Do you want to just comment to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are. I think we've inevitably sort of high graded the planet, really, and we need to now think about and as grades decline. I mean, grades decline for other reasons as well. You know, one of the reasons copper grades have declined is we're working porphyry copper deposits, which are low grade, but they're more suited to the sort of style of mining we do. But I think that we are, you know, there are thermodynamic limits for some things that I mean, platinum is the obvious one where we're possibly approaching the thermodynamic limits of what it's possible to extract from rock. So I would still say fundamentally the metal is down there. It's whether we can afford the environmental cost, and that is wrapped up in the economic cost of working it. And you could very strongly argue, and I'm sure a lot of people on this conference will agree, that the price of metal does not reflect the true environmental cost of production.
Oh, exactly. And I think that this is something here where we could go back to a lot of what Nadia said in the previous conversation to say, actually, where do you put that true value on those assets? And then this morning, some of the information that Zach and Aidan were sharing with us around, yes, what is that whole value with regards to an asset, not just now, but through its life cycle as a whole.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew. Massive hands together from behind our microphones as a whole. That's absolutely brilliant. Now, just as we flick across from the wonderful Andrew Bloodworth to the fantastic Richard Harrington, you're both wonderful, obviously. So we're going to come across to Richard now. So just while Richard comes off his mute and begins to share his screen, we're going to attempt to do something a little bit different here. And what you will see appearing in the chat, and also we will share it with those of you on YouTube as well. There is a Mentimeter word cloud that we've just set up. And what we're asking you is, what word or term should we be using instead of stakeholder? Because it is dominating our chat so much. We're asking you that question. So hopefully this is something here where what I will do is I will open the session in a second, and you guys will be able to add in what you think should be the answer to the word cloud. If this doesn't work, I will send you through another link in a second. So as you can imagine, we are just multitasking at the moment. But Richard, are you there? And would you like to start your wonderful presentation? And then after your presentation, we'll come back into this concept of stakeholders.
Right, can you see my presentation?
We can, but we can see it in full. There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. And it's great to follow Andrew, who sort of set the scene about the whole concept of running out. So maybe we can skip over that pretty quickly. But actually, I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about how we might diversify supplies. And I'm specifically going to talk about cobalt, because there are issues with regard to that. And I just want to pay attention to my colleagues here, been involved in two key projects here. One that was funded by the Research Council in the UK, COG3, which was looking at, under the SOS, Security of Supply of metals. And we've now got a European project called Crocodile, with a rather snappy title, that's talking about secondary supply streams for cobalt for Europe, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and that fits into the whole talk. But I really want to set the scene by talking about cobalt production first off, because that's clearly cobalt's recognised as a primary metal for the transition that we're making into the green economy. But it also has other uses. The current mine production is about 125,000 tonnes a year, and around 45% is currently headed for lithium-ion battery production. So that still means 55% of it is used for other sort of high-tech uses, and you'll see there's a list of things there, all very important for modern industry. It's also one of the few bioessential metals. It's a vital part of vitamin B12, and it's interesting, a deficiency in humans can lead to symptoms of anxiety, which is quite an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so cobalt isn't going to be running out anytime soon, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but there are supply squeeze issues currently around us. And one of those supply issues is the fact that the UK, among other countries, has pledged to move to net zero carbon by 2050. As part of that, the Committee on Climate Change say that the vehicle fleet, the private vehicle fleet in the UK, should be all battery electric by 2050. So if we just simply take what the UK has as a car fleet now, and we convert all of those current internal combustion engine cars to battery electric vehicles, that will take 207,000 tonnes of cobalt. So that's about 2 years of world supply at current rate. So you can see, if you scale that up to the world, and we all want to do that by 2050, it means that we will have to more than triple current cobalt production and remain at that level until 2050 to satisfy the demand. Now, another squeeze issue is the fact that 95% of the world cobalt supply is a byproduct of mining major metals, particularly, as you see here, copper, and to a slightly lesser degree, nickel. And Dan Smith yesterday talked about tellurium, which is another metal that sits into that problem. And all of those key critical metals are usually, because it's one of the aspects of it is because it's a byproduct of a major metal production. So obviously individual mine closures, the copper mine closing, could actually affect the byproduct supply of cobalt, which has happened recently in the DRC. And then there's very strong geographical supply issues, the DRC factor, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at where cobalt is being sourced from, This is a 2018 graph from the USGS, and it shows that the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, dominates the supply of raw, newly mined cobalt, around 55%. And of that, 10%, but it made up to 15 or 20%, according to a 2018 study, is actually from what we might call individual mines. So this will be artisanal mines or small-scale miners, which are less well regulated and have been attributed issues of child labour and unregulated mining practices. And generally, these are thought of as very unwelcome to have that kind of tainting in the supply chain. And so obviously looking for ways of broadening that risk geographically, geopolitically would be really, really good. So we can look in there at other countries that are producing. So we can look there, for example, Cuba and New Caledonia. So these are areas where there's cobalt production from nickel mining that potentially could be scaled up in other parts of the world. The one place where cobalt, there's a single country in the world, single set of deposits in the world where cobalt is the main commodity. So it's not a byproduct, and that is in Morocco. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. These are very complex arsenic-rich ores that have been mined there for a number of years, but they only account for around 2% of world production currently. So there's also a geological monopoly, if you like, on cobalt supply. So around 60% of it is linked to the large copper deposits in the copper belts. So that includes the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Zambia. And then about 20% of it's coming as a byproduct of nickel laterite mining. Then magmatic nickel sulfides supply about 15%, and that's largely recovered at smelter as a credit from the sulfides as a minor component. And then there's around 5% called here miscellaneous, which includes those arsenic-rich deposits in Morocco. So we're not going to run out. And just to give you the reason why that's the case, just have to look at, you've probably heard about manganese nodules. So oceanic manganese nodules discovered in the 19th century by the HMS Challenger expedition, which is going to have actually 150th anniversary actually in 2022. And our museum actually has the type specimen of that nodule. So it was discovered a very long time ago, heavily explored in the late 20th century. The global resources of those nodules are likely to contain 120 million tons of cobalt. So that's practically, in our scale of industrially, we might even term it limitless for human needs. And so there are evaluations going on to mine in the deep ocean, but there are some clear issues there: environmental permitting and social licensing. So these things don't appear to be there in the midterm, but long term, they kind of underwrite. If you like, it's the underwriting of cobalt supply if we ever need to get to those resources. There's other terrestrial potential too. So there's quite a lot of under-evaluated cobalt in sedimentary copper systems. At the moment, 60% of the cobalt's coming from Central Africa, from Zambia and DRC. But there are other basins where these types of deposits are being mined. There's the Kupfer Schiefer in Poland, where we know there is cobalt, it's not being recovered. There's a lot of cobalt in lateritic nickel deposits, but the processing technology dictates whether the cobalt's recovered or not. And quite a few places around the world don't recover the cobalt from their nickel mining, and that would include Greece. So potentially there's a European producer that could be producing cobalt, but currently throws that away and doesn't recover it. And so there's lots of cobalt that reports to sulfide tailings, and a key example of that would be the Kasese deposit in Uganda, where actually the pyrite waste has gone back to and the cobalt's been recovered from it, and it's cleaned the site up. We also know that there are old mining camps with new potential. So the famous cobalt district in Canada mined very complex arsenide ores for silver back in the early 20th century, and these could be reinvestigated for their cobalt content, and there are a number of companies looking into that. There have also been some discoveries of some unconventional cobalt-only laterites and some other types of sedimentary deposits, which I shall mention briefly. And then I'm going to mention a little bit about how new resources just could be unlocked by new technologies. And these are resources that we've already defined, but by introducing some technologies like hydrometallurgy and bio-recovery, we might be better placed to recover those metals. So there's a whole bunch of deposits out there that have potential to recover cobalt. They're geologically diverse. So we've got the sedimentary copper group here that's shown in blue ring. These cobalt-only deposits are like the Cobalt Ontario group, is shown there in red, and then some magmatic nickel deposits where these could be covered. In Central Africa too, we don't really understand the distribution of cobalt. It's not uniform throughout the belts. The little triangles in red show the cobalt-rich deposits. The black spots are showing the deposits that are rich in copper. And actually, if you look in detail in the copper belt, so on the right-hand side, the left-hand side there, you see a little diagram there, and it's a grade distribution map from the Nchanga mine. And at the top, you see the distribution of cobalt. So the red, the warm colors show very high numbers, and the bottom is the copper grade, similar thing. And you can see the cobalt and the copper don't follow one another directly. And that's shown on the right-hand side, a graphic log there. You can see the peak in copper content in a drill hole through the sequence there. And actually some sections are really copper rich with a little bit of cobalt, and others are quite cobalt dominant. So it's very interesting that understanding that geological distribution isn't clear. And we could take that to look at other basins, and we know in the Kutri-Schiefer there is cobalt in that basin. It's currently not recovered through the mining techniques they use, and there's good potential there of recovering cobalt from that particular deposit. And so there are other basins that could be looked at for potential for cobalt recovery. In Europe, there have been some discoveries of some interesting deposits. This is the Talvivaara deposit in Finland, low-grade shale sulfide deposit that has actually had this new technology I'm going to talk about, bioleaching applied to it. And this is a potential large source of cobalt, very low grade, but a huge resource. I talked a little bit about these arsenide deposits in Morocco. They're being mined currently. They're producing about between 1% and 3% of the world's cobalt. There is a problem with the arsenic, but in Morocco, they developed really very good technologies of being able to recover the arsenic. And in fact, there is a market for arsenic, surprisingly, and these are still quite economic and making good money. And we talked about Ontario. There are deposits that were previously mined for silver, for thin, high-grade silver cobalt veins. The cobalt was largely neglected, wasn't recovered. There's large amounts of tailings in that region, but also areas where the cobalt grades were higher than silver. They were never mined, and there is potential for cobalt recovery. Also, we know a large number of massive sulfide deposits have cobalt credits, some of which that have been exploited in the past, some of which remain dormant. And these are potential further deposits that could offer us that diversity of supply. And then the last talk about magmatic nickel deposits. This is actually some images from the new the Sakatti discovery of Anglo-American up in Finland. And actually what we found there is that the pyritic facies of the mineralization, which on the face of it would in the past might have been thought of as waste, and that would have reported to tailings, it's actually running 2% cobalt, and it is obviously a potential resource. And it does beg the question that there may be piles of mined tailings, Fennoscandia, that could be running quite significant cobalt that could be recovered. I mentioned unconventional laterites where cobalt dominates. So there's a really interesting one in Cameroon. where very large deposit where the cobalt grade is abnormally high for this type of deposit. So the cobalt to nickel ratio is 1 to 3, which is much higher. It's normally much lower than that. It's usually 1% for every percent nickel, and so this represents a very large unexploited new type of deposit. And I mentioned Europe, where Greece, with their mining nickel laterites currently, they're not recovering cobalt, and all the nickel laterites that are through the Balkan regions have a significant cobalt credit. And this region, we're talking about locavorism, which was mentioned in the Q&A session. There is a potential if Europe wants to mine more locally, that we could recover cobalt from indigenous resources. And now, for the last part of my talk, I'm going to unashamedly talk about the research projects that we've been working on, which is introducing some strategies that are potentially have a lower energy footprint, and this is to use bioprocessing strategies in cobalt ores, particularly ores that have already been broken. Perhaps they're part of the waste stream, or they're currently reporting to the waste. So this is, if you like, the more oxide-rich parts of laterites, which are generally more cobalt-rich than the saprolitic ores that are higher in nickel, and then some of the sulfide ores and actually the arsenic-rich ores, where a lot of the cobalt might be reporting to sulfide waste. And there, the use of bioprocessing strategies has been shown to be able to unlock cobalt as a new type of technology to introduce into the stream. So this technology is proven for cobalt recovery from sulfide wastes. Kasese mine in Uganda was a case where an environmental disaster of acidic mine waste, acid generating mine waste, was cleaned up and cobalt was recovered as a result. And our projects demonstrated this type of technology also works for lateritic nickel cobalt deposits. And it shows promise actually from the experiments we've done for the arsenical ores from Ontario and Morocco, and it leads to formation of quite stable arsenates. So this bioprocessing technology has now been incorporated into a large EU project called Crocodile, and I'm going to spend the last minute of my talk talking about that. This is where we're looking now, as it was mentioned before by Andrew Bloodworth here, that actually as we move forward, we're going to be generating a lot of these metals. They're going to be in the supply chain, and we can start to, if you like, mine these from the circular economy. And part of that waste could be, part of that secondary chain could be old mine waste or neglected parts of the ore supply chain. And so this project that we have called Crocodile is actually looking at how we can build a secondary supply of cobalt before we get to the position where we're ending up by producing all these battery electric vehicles with no way of recovering it. And so this project, Crocodile, is looking at how we can use waste both from lithium-ion batteries, also from waste steel and catalysts, and then also supplementing that with material from waste material from ore streams of existing mines and other European mines. And we bring all of those together into a mixed supply chain that will then develop a set of material that can go into the cobalt refineries. And so we're working with major mining companies involved in this, but also companies involved in the manufacturing and waste supply chain, as well as the mining, the primary mining suite. So just in summary, to finish up, there's a reticence to use Central African sources of cobalt and because of all those supply chain issues, potential contamination with supply from environmentally and socially unacceptable sources. We know we're not going to run out, but we do think there are other deposit types are ripe for co-recovery of cobalt to supply this demand in the medium term. But we do need to have more investigation to understand where it resides and then bring in some methods to help co-recover that cobalt. And we've seen that there are unconventional cobalt-only deposits that remain largely untested by modern methods. And some of these new technologies like bioprocessing show promise for recovering cobalt from these unconventional ores and even the secondary supply chain. And we see those as ways of reducing the energy footprint of this supply of metal. And as Andrew alluded to in the previous talk, that's one of the biggest challenges that the mining industry faces is actually reducing that energy footprint. And this talk maybe has given you some insights into perhaps how that can be done. And then the other thing to say is that we should be building a secondary supply from potential waste and scrap sources before we start producing all this scrap waste. And hopefully projects like Crocodile will mean that there will be, when we start having this material coming in, the newly mined raw materials, we don't lose them in the circular economy. And then we can actually start to reduce the amount of newly mined cobalt that we might need. Okay, I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Richard. So massive round of applause from all of us on the other end of the microphones. And I'm going to come to one of the questions that's coming through to you. They're now beginning to flow. So apologies to everybody. I'm going to the top question that came in. And this comes from Mikhail. And he says, very interesting talk. Catherine Goodenough, who I know you know very well, Richard, discussed this morning the diversification of producing countries for rare earth elements and some of the environmental issues that emerged as a result of that, i.e. an increase in the number of small operations that may not actually have the resources to ensure full compliance and or the recycling of waste. Do you forecast something similar if that were to happen to cobalt? And he also says, love your virtual background, by the way.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've just been playing around with Zoom, trying to become a super user. No, yeah, with regard to, yes, I mean, that's a great question, isn't it? Do we want to have a few very large deposits where we can control the footprint of them environmentally and so on? There is this problem, if you start to diversify, you then create lots of different sites with the same problems. But I mean, I'm speaking at it from the securing the supply chain. We can just see what the problems are. I mean, if you get a blockage in the supply chain from one of these countries, I mean, and it happened in the DRC, and the big mines close, and then you suddenly lose a huge supply of cobalt. And a downstream user, a battery manufacturer, will lose the supply. So that is the biggest, for me, the biggest reason to diversify that is to improve the supply chain. It's like consumer choice. You know, you wouldn't want just to have one supermarket that would be the only place you could get food. And I think the COVID crisis has told us about, you know, getting the supply chain of raw materials for what you want to do right. So I think diversification is good. That doesn't mean we should actually do things in a worse fashion. And in actual fact, what I'm suggesting, a lot of the new cobalt could come from potential waste sources or things that we're throwing away currently. And actually by having these new technologies, we can actually adjunct those to existing operations and increase, like we've done some, even with the Greek nickel industry, we can increase cobalt supply, indigenous cobalt supply by a significant amount for Europe. And similarly, waste from sulfide mining elsewhere. So I think it's kind of a mixture of getting a diverse supply chain, but not compromising the footprint. And I think this is where, if we can start to get it from some of these unconventional wastes, then I think that would improve the situation.
Brilliant. And well, with that, thank you very, very much, Richard. There are more questions for you up there in the Q&A, so I can direct them towards them afterwards. But another round of applause. Thank you very much for the fantastic Richard Harrington. Brilliant. Now, we've been talking cobalt, and so of course we've been talking batteries, and of course there's something else that is very topical with regards to batteries, and that is of course lithium. So now we're going to come across to Hanu. So Hanu, if you want to unmute yourself and begin to share your screen, we'll bring you into this conversation. Hannu is talking to us from an organization that actually makes use of all of this lovely lithium. And Hannu, I'm hoping if you can share your screen now. Yep, here we come. Fantastic. You'll be able to tell us all about Keliber and what it is that you're up to. Thank you.
Thanks. This is Hannu speaking here from Finland, from southern Finland at the moment, although Keliber mine locations or planned mine locations are in central Finland. I pointed out one piece of information from Richard, the presentation. Richard, you mentioned Talvivaara. Talvivaara doesn't exist anymore in Finland as a company, but it is nowadays Terrafame. If you click on the Terrafame webpage, you will see the whole story there. But now I talk about Keliber. Keliber is a lithium project company, the most advanced one in Europe. My name is Hannu Hautala. I'm CEO of the company since 2 months. I started in mid of March. My focus has been primarily on capacity side during the first 2 months and on investors. And this presentation is shortened from one investor presentation. It is not very technical one. It is more about capacities and markets and dynamics and that kind of things. My background is in steel industry mainly, although I have worked at the electronics manufacturing services as well. I try to change the page, but it doesn't. Somehow it doesn't change the page now. Now it is changing. So repeating the same things which have certainly been discussed. The megatrends, electrification of transportation, renewable energy production, energy must be stored, and lithium is an important element there, and consumer electronics, of course, as a one important part. But primarily, it is about the vehicles, electrical vehicles, which are driving the need for lithium and lithium demand growth. It is coming from automotive market development. First of all, reducing the pollution. Secondly, the regulation is tightening. And the third one, price of lithium-ion battery production or lithium-ion batteries is going down as the number of batteries or electrical vehicles on the road and on the market is increasing. There are different scenarios for EV market growth. Some of them forecast 30% annual growth, like the latest Roskill research study on the 5th of May, just a couple of days ago. These informations which are visible on the screen are from the end of 2019, and they are a little bit lower growth rates visible there. Anyhow, all these forecasts, they talk about double digit, either 16 or 18% annual growth, or even up to 30% annual growth. It depends which time period is there and which market is on the radar. If the entire lithium market is on the radar, then the growth rate is lower. If it's about the battery grade, then the percentages are higher. We are located, like I say, in central Finland. On the upper right corner, you see the Scandinavia, Norway on the left, and Sweden, Finland with the darker gray color there, and in central Finland at the coastline, our locations are Kaustinen, ore bodies 50 kilometers away from the coastline, and then Kokkola is our planned location for chemical factory. We have mineral resources around about 12 million tons. We keep drilling every week. Summer break will start soon at the end of the May. Anyhow, Not included in those mineral resources visible on this screen, we have found new openings, new findings, even during the latest weeks and months. We plan for integrated production, so starting from own mine, the own concentration plant, and the own lithium hydroxide operation at the harbor of Kokkola, and our target market is battery producers for electrical vehicles in Europe. Highlights of our project: we are aiming to be the first one in Europe, first one to produce battery-grade lithium hydroxide from own ore. The ore body in Kaustinen has been known already 30-40 years, and 3 or 4 companies are active there since 2003, and now they are all now the entire project is in the hands of Keliber. We calculate with 15,000 tons annual lithium hydroxide production, and with that speed, at the moment we have ore reserves for 13+ years, and we find more with each drilling day when we work at the ore. We are, according to calculations, a low-cost producer. Lowest cost producers are around 4,000 euro per ton, and we go maybe slightly below. So we are one of the top players in terms of cost efficiency. We have calculated recently 20+%, 21-22% IRR, and we calculate below 5 years payback time, and like in the previous is well known and established reliable sustainable mining country, and we have a clear way forward with the project timeline. We are at the moment at the pre-construction phase. We have filed in all environmental permits which will be needed, and we plan to start the construction in 2022, and at the end of 2024 we will ramp up our lithium hydroxide production, and in a volume production we will be then in 25-26, and it looks that this fits very well together with the market growth. Then further opportunities, organic growth. We of course focus on the maximizing the efficiencies and production volumes, and we also have some ideas to build the second line in the Kokkola harbor, and also the recycling as the number 3 on the right. Recycling is an opportunity. We could use the same technology which we use for ore processing, also for certain stages at the for recycled lithium fractions. So Keliber aiming for the first vertically integrated lithium producer in Europe, and I fully agree that the coronavirus epidemic will change the supply chains in automotive industry and also in other industries, and it is good to be the first European producer of lithium.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Hannu, for dialing in from Finland to share all of that with us. That was fantastic. And in your imagination, you can hear the fantastic round of applause from the other side of all those muted microphones. Now, as per usual, we have lots of lovely chatter going on, be it in our Q&A or in our chat, and also on YouTube as well. But just to ask you a question that has been running as a theme throughout this session, And that question is around stakeholder engagement and the variety of different stakeholders. Have you had, and I realize that you've only been CEO for 2 months, so please forgive me for this question. Have you had any problems or seen any new approaches with regards to stakeholder engagement in the process of getting your lithium project up and off the ground?
Certainly there is work to do and interesting, challenging things. Anyhow, it looks that my predecessors and my colleagues have done very good work in terms of taking care of neighbors and taking care of even small shareholders who are coming from the surrounding communities, etc. I haven't faced such problems with the Keliber lithium operation, which I have faced, for example, at the industrial minerals limestone company, Nordkalk, where I was CEO previously. It looks that people understand that lithium is needed for the climate change. Secondly, our ore is located in a very rural place where peat operating is taking place. Peat is used as an energy and energy source, and it causes quite a bit CO2, and it must be reduced. And it is great to replace the working places at the peat production with the lithium production.
Brilliant, thank you. So maybe actually something, Hannu, kind of drawing on your previous experience. I think you mentioned you were from the steel industry originally, is that correct? Maybe drawing on that then from a sustainability and a responsibility aspect, what can we in raw materials be doing better? So this might be through steel production, but also in the world of lithium as well. What do you hope for the future from a responsibility stance?
Two things come into my mind. First of all, increase recycling. Steel industry, especially stainless steel, is pretty good at recycling. Stainless steel is mostly recycled, and it is good to keep in mind that steel doesn't get worse when it is recycled. And that same will be valid also for lithium. Also, lithium is more difficult to recycle than iron or chromium or nickel. Then the second thing is to use new technologies. You see in steel industry number of initiatives. One is number of initiatives to eliminate CO2 emissions totally, and that is done by using iron ore in a different form than until today, and then to process iron ore in electric arc furnace instead of blast furnace, and this eliminates CO2 production caused by coal used in blast furnaces. So this is a very, very valid and good example from new technology application in steel industry. And the SSAB is active there, Aperam is active there, ThyssenKrupp is active there, and First Alpine, Austrian steel company, is active there.
Brilliant. So it's looking at both the recycling element, but also the way in which the processing is undertaken. So trying to look for methods that might be less carbon intensive, for example, as a whole. That's brilliant. Just picking up on your recycling comment there, and somebody told me, this is a number of years ago, that most of the world's lithium batteries that are being produced at the moment are not being manufactured to be easily recycled. Do you know anything about that? Is that true? Is that changing? What's happening with regards to the recyclability of our lithium batteries?
There are a number of studies ongoing. Anyhow, it looks that it is the lithium is the most difficult element to recycle. And now I need to admit that I'm in a learning curve, but looks that the contents, first of all are very low. The electrical vehicle batteries recycling is more for the future. The cars are now coming new on the market, and it will take 10-15 years before the volumes are to be recycled. The volumes recycled from mobile phones are still more small compared to the cars. So once the volumes grow, I believe that the technologies are also improved, and the technologies will be developed, and they will be capable. And Keliber is interested in, and Keliber is contributing to recycling technology.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much, Hannu. Thank you for coming to speak to us in your first 2 months in your new position as CEO, and good luck to the future of Keliber. That's fantastic. Round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hannu. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just before we go to our next speaker, who is Norman Gridley, and I'll just let Hannu stop sharing his screen now, because what I'm going to share with you is the Mentimeter online thought cloud or word cloud that we've all been contributing to, or some people have been contributing to over the last few talks. So hopefully you can see what is on my screen at the moment. So as you can see, we're mashing up or mixing up all the different technology that we have available, and building on that conversation with regards to how should we be using or reusing different terms with regards to stakeholder. You can see that interested party, rights holder, community interest, beneficiaries, landholder, lots about parties, associates, partners, affected, interested population, etc. So all of this coming to the fore. And I think this is something where it really hammers home that yes, there are lots of different words, there are lots of different terms that we can use, but coming back to some of those underlying comments that were made, is it's not necessarily the terminology that we're using, it's actually what we're doing. So it's the process and the action that really sits below it. And there's been quite an interesting flow of conversation on YouTube with regards to that as a whole. So thank you very much to everybody who contributed to the word cloud there. So without further ado, because I'm acutely aware of the time, and yes, people are still adding into the word cloud, that's great. I'm going to now pass across to the wonderful Norman Gridley. Now, Norm is sitting in Santiago, Chile, so we really are doing laps of the world today. We're going all the way from Finland to Chile, and Norm is going to talk to us about some of the mechanisms through which we might be able to redesign our mine plans and so therefore enhance sustainability. Norm, over to your wonderful self.
Yeah, great. Can you see my screen?
We can indeed. Thank you, sir.
Oh, good. All right, so my backdrop up to now, I'm Norm Gridley, I'm in Santiago, Chile. Great to see you all. And thanks a lot for the invitation, and Sarah, Rose, fantastic work. I've only been able to be in a few sessions, but I'm really impressed. And great session this morning too. Great people. So look, I'm a technical kind of person. I'm a civil engineer, and I've worked on design, construction, permitting, operation, and closure of open pit and underground mines. And so my bent towards this will be very clear from my slides. You know, with the focus is responsible raw materials. And so how do we enhance our mining planning to enhance sustainability? And why isn't my screen advancing? All right, there we are. I guess this is an unnamed open pit. It's just a generic off the web. So if anyone knows where it is, let me know, but I don't. I just want to ask the question here. Is this a waste when it's all done, when we're all done mining this, which looks like it's getting close unless they go underground? Is it a waste? Is it something to be managed as a waste, or is it a resource? And we'll look at this, say a generic downstream construction tailings basin from flotation mining. Is that a waste or is it a resource? I say that because we're talking about changing the paradigm, right? We're talking about the circular economy. We're talking about how to make people realize that what we call waste may not be waste. They may be resources. Now, we've heard plenty of talk here about mining in the future. There's been a reference to how resources become reserves or become economic. I know, excuse me, Anthony, if I get the wording wrong. But the point being that over time, waste can become resources. And this has to do with what's available, what's needed, what's affordable, but also has to do with environmental permitting, land availability, social suitability, all those other factors that make a potential deposit, which may have been here, was here beforehand, something that can be exploited or not exploited. And so my point being, the mine planning that goes into this sort of design is fairly traditional based on what I've seen. I'm not a mine planner, but I've worked in the design of and approval of mines, and I've seen what the mine planners do. And I've seen the parameters that they put in to build the mine plan for this deposit. And also mention when we look at this picture that these kind of installations in central Chile, where I live, are going to become harder and harder and harder to locate. So there may be, in fact, on paper, well more than 100 years of resources of copper for the companies that own those rights here, the biggest one being Codelco, the state company. And there maybe 100 years. So one of the articles I saw recently indicated almost 200 years of resources. But that's not 200 years of space for tailings. The copper we're mining at this level is, usually below 1% grade. So everything is ending up in a deposit like this. Can't be sustainable. This can't work in the long run. So something I'm pitching here is to say, why should mine plans be designed? Well, current day open pit mine pit planning considers these variables as a minimum. And please correct me if I'm missing anything, anyone who's doing mine planning, but I know we have to consider, after we have the deposit, of course, and we know there's a deposit here, and we have the land rights, and we have the ability to go in here, say, we need temporary and permanent access. We need to move waste material. We need to dispose of it. We're going to recover ore. We're going to do pushbacks and benches and so on. We're going to design the pit for infrastructure limits, because we know that as the ore becomes maybe more exploitable in future, depending on the value of, we can say copper in this case, the pit may want to be larger. And we're going to do, with all of that, some financial modeling or analysis. We're going to do some financial analysis. And it generates a financially viable ore extraction program. It's effectively what the mine plan does from what I've seen, but it does not consider the excavated zone that we've made having value. It's considered an issue. It's considered a closure issue. And so why isn't it considered a value? Well, part of the problem is we're still working a lot, in most cases, with NPV analysis. So when we talk about mines that are going to operate, new ones for 25, 30 or more years, bringing back the closure costs into present day value is almost unmeasurable in terms of its impact. And I consider that should be changed. This approach should be changed. What's the proposal I'm putting here? The very simple proposal, and has lots to do with timing of how these things are done. But add to the process the following. Well, consider the permanent placement of tailings. Can we put some tailings in that open pit? Sure we can. That's being done. It's not being done at a macro scale yet, but it's being done. Can we close the pit using tailings and other waste materials as appropriate to the scheduling of the pit? Sure we can. Can we reduce the long-term liabilities associated with those deposits? Well, of course. Maybe not eliminate them, of course. I'm not suggesting this eliminates liabilities, but it changes them. And then we would incorporate this tailings deposit modification in the financial model or the economic analysis of the mine plan. What does it do? It modifies the mine plan in a way to provide the operation with alternatives to massive tailings deposits. Now, I say this from some personal experience I had recently on a project that's now under construction in Peru. It's called Quellaveco. It is a large open pit mine. It will generate this sort of hole in the ground. It won't look exactly like that. And it will also generate tailings. But after 24 years of mining, they will also move to place tailings and waste rock back in the open pit. And they will continue to operate with a stockpile of ore and use that open pit to recreate a filled area. Now, it doesn't look like this, but that will be partially filled when it's done. And that will be done with tailings and waste rock. So what I'm referring to here is a modification to the mine plan, not for the whole life of mine, all 30 years, but for 6 years of the 30 years. It's just one example, okay? That particular project, we've heard a lot about stakeholders and community engagement as well. That project did go through a very extensive stakeholder engagement process, or we could say interested party process, which included a dialogue table that was managed by the regional government. In that case, the Mokewa government. Very interesting work, and there's some papers on that, plenty of publications out there on that. And that included community and stakeholder engagement in the discussion of the closure plan. And in that case, the closure plan was agreed to be changed in the course of that dialogue process. The change was incorporated that I mentioned, a closure that would bring the pit back up to original water level, river level, and then eliminate in effect a pit lake. So changing the closure plan, something that in the NPV analysis is not highly measurable in terms of the decision of the company, but still a commitment of the company to do a lot of new things in 24 years' time. So I'm giving this as an example of how mine plans can be changed. I realize that this proposal is not something that people talk about today when they're planning a new mine. They look at the deposit. Of course, without a deposit, there's no mine. And then they look at land rights, and then they look at communities, and they look at all these things that come along. They do stakeholder engagement, consultation, indigenous peoples, if that's applicable. But how often do they say, how can we close this with minimum liability in the long run? And that's clearly what we should be thinking. We're talking about responsible extraction of raw materials. We're saying, how do we leave less liability in the future and a resource that other people can use in the future? We go right through to the end of this, and we say, what would the benefits be? It's a circular economy. It's a subset of this discussion. I realize I'm really focusing on the open pit and the tailings, but it is a subset. So we're converting waste materials into a resource. That's effectively what we're saying. We're reducing the land requirements for permanent tailings disposal. And as I mentioned at my start of my discussion, I can look out my window here in Santiago and I can see the mountains where these deposits are today that are being planned to be exploited in 10, 15, 20 years. And I know that there's no one in these communities who's going to say, great, you can put a tailings basin over there, sure. I can't see it. Personally, I can't see that happening. There has to be a better way to manage the waste materials that we're generating. Reducing land requirements, and then reducing, of course, the long-term environmental risks and environmental liabilities. So are there case studies? My question is, are there case studies at large scale? How can we convince mine planners to think this way, or really, in effect, get people out of the silos, right? I mean, it's not just convincing mine planners, it's convincing the boards and the technical managers and the social managers, the environmental managers, the people doing consultation, to think more broadly about how to design this. This can be applicable to a greenfield site as well as to a brownfield. In fact, in many cases, I believe brownfield operations sometimes have more opportunity like this because they've already created deposits of waste or open pits or underground deposits in which they can place waste material. So that's really my conclusion. I was going to also show the goals and just say, well, which of these goals are we talking about here? Quite a few of them. If we can do this, we're clearly talking about water and sanitation, keeping water clean. We're talking about actually potentially, we're talking about innovation in number 9. We're talking about life below water and life on land. We're talking about partnership. We're talking about things that will provide benefits to the surrounding community and to the company and to all involved in these undertakings. They are massive and they will continue. I think the current rate of closure of copper mines today is just slightly lower than the rate of development of new copper mines today. So it means that these projects are being developed pretty much every day as we go. And I'm interested in presenting this proposal to all of you to say, let's push this. I'd like to push it in some way. Don't know how exactly, but I'm starting here. And I think that takes my 10 minutes. And I'm going to open up to whatever questions or thoughts you may have. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Norm. And yes, as per usual, you can hear that round of imaginary applause from the other side of those muted microphones. So thank you very, very much for your talk there. Now, as per usual, we have a number of questions coming in. And the first question we have is from Sandra, and she's asking, how can the remining of tailings be robustly included in the mine closure project? So how can you formally bring it into that mine closure project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as we know, at least with the materials I'm talking about here, like hard rock mining for, say, copper, if we remine the tailings, we still end up with tailings. So we still have to manage the tailings, right? But we can do better things with those tailings, because by remining the tailings, depending on the economics here, we will generate a resource. First, we'll be generating a copper resource or a metal resource. We'll be generating some revenue. We can then manage the tailings that we produce in a different way as well. It's not even mentioned that tailings can be managed with more water extraction than we do today. Many ranges of that, right up to paste production or even solid. And make stack tailings, paste tailings, thickened tailings. So recover water as well. And then put the tailings in a different place, because they will be handled again. So if you're doing that, you can say, now we can look at what other alternatives do we have to use for these tailings. I was recently involved in a very short analysis of possibilities for large-scale tailings deposits, where discussions were brought up about making building materials, making bricks, making sub-base for roads. This requires redefinition of regulations too. In Chile, mine waste can't be used in certain areas. It's called mine waste. So the regulations would have to catch up and say, we're going to take these tailings and use them elsewhere. But I guess, am I answering the question? Yes, reprocessing of tailings can generate revenue, which can allow you to do better things in terms of your final closure.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Sandra. Thank you very much for that one. Norm, we've got another question that's come in. What we're asked here is, storing tailings in mined out areas is a good idea for mines where resource extraction is complete. There's no possibility for re-entry due to commodity price increases or whatever the case might be. That being said, I believe that mine designs that incorporate tailings disposal within waste dump facilities deserve much more attention. I don't know if you just want to comment on that.
Of course. Yeah, I know. And I mean, I didn't add that in. It's true. You'd have to manage the waste differently, create a liner, make sure that you weren't going to generate environmental pollution from that. Same with the pit deposit. But you're absolutely right. And that was a concern in the project I mentioned, where when we start to put waste back in this pit in 24 years' time, let's say, the planners will say, wait a minute, now you're losing the resource. The resource is no longer available once we do that. That's correct. It's true. So maybe you'd have to look at combining the waste with waste rock in some other setting. It's true. But that may require you to crush the waste rock, create a liner, create a water recovery system, all those goodies. Nonetheless, it's possible to incorporate that in mine planning.
Brilliant. Thank you, Norm. I'm going to actually pass across to Nadia now, because Nadia's got a follow-up question based off that first one that you answered. Nadia, over to yourself.
Thanks, Sarah. And Norm, you just touched on co-disposal, which is part of my question. So I was actually curious on your thoughts on that as we think about you know, the potential for reprocessing down the road. What are your thoughts around how, I guess follows from Sandra's question about designing for potential future reprocessing, but how does the co-disposal influence or impede our ability to do future reprocessing if we're mixing together waste rock with tailings?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the goal is to get as much metal out as possible today, isn't it? So if we're talking about a new project today, I realize it's not historic. The historic situation is very different, where there are tailings that are now resources. And we know that all around the world. We see lots of sites where tailings are being processed as a resource, and so are waste rock. But if we talk about a new project, what I've seen in my experience recently is that there's a lot of effort made to get the maximum possible recovery right through to the tailings, so the tailings are not a resource anymore for recovery of ore. And in that case, if you do co-dispose with, say, acid-generating waste rock, you're disposing of something safely, but it won't be a resource anymore. But if you have other material that you feel could be a resource in the future, you have to put that elsewhere. It's true. You have to look at where you would place materials in the future and then recover them. And one project that I've worked on is one where they are going to stockpile that material as waste rock for use in 25 years' time, and then recover the waste rock and call it waste rock of low grade. So it's not actually waste. It's called high grade waste. And by that 25 years' time, we can assume the value of copper in the marketplace is likely to be higher, not lower. So you can't build that in the model yet, but you know when 25 years comes, someone will say, who came up with this closure plan? Anyway, was that Norman? And they say, where is that guy? And I say, wait a minute now, this is an economic project. This is not just cost. This is also recovering materials to do closure. That's the idea.
Well, we've had a lot of discussion about different word on stakeholder. I think we could do the same with waste, because I agree with you. With the term waste is assumes potentially that it isn't valuable, but I think you're absolutely right. Maximizing recovery should be key.
Can I add a comment here on an experience I had in Canada? Actually, I lived in Canada for quite a few years, and I worked on a solid waste recovery project in the Eastern Canada in Halifax, where they were disposing 95% of the municipal waste from a city of 250,000, and the landfill was filled. No one was ever going to look at another landfill, forget it. And I with another fellow managed a project supported by the regional government to develop an integrated waste management plan, which converted waste to resource. It was called an integrated waste/resource management plan. And the whole idea was to change the paradigm. So people could say their waste, hey, this waste actually has about 75% resources in it. If you take the obviously, the paper stream, the recyclables, and especially the organics. And that was set up, and that was done through a paradigm shift. But it required quite a bit of time of education to get there. How quickly does the mining industry change its approach to mine planning? I would say very slowly. But we have new challenges where we can't get things cited. We can't cite those facilities I'm referring to. So you say, good, how do we do it now in a more creative way? So when we cite this, we're saying to people, we are using some of this area as a deposit area. That land will be usable in the future in some way. You won't have houses on it, but you can actually have a level piece of land, which may be productive, right? Depending on the water availability. I hope that answers and gives a bit of insight as to what I've been involved in, because I really believe in the paradigm shift. It's really, really big in this.
Brilliant. So thank you very, very much for that, Nadia, and also Norm, for that brilliant insight and actually bringing an extra dimension with regards to, I think, some of our thinking that we've been going through today. So another virtual round of applause for yourself, Norm, all the way down there in Santiago. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to head back up to the Northern Hemisphere, and we're going to go to Toronto. At least I think that's where Monica is. Monica's usually in Toronto when she's not traveling. And Monica is going to share with us some of her insight with regards to the social aspects and with regards to mining as a whole. So Monica, if you want to come off mute and begin to find that share screen button. I know that we were having some problems earlier, but I'm sure it's all sorted now. See, look at that. It's truly brilliant. So brilliant, fantastic. Okay, we're looking at the other version of your screen at the moment, but if you're happy to continue, we can just keep moving with it, Monica. And you'll need to come off mute as well. And I'll keep gently talking until Monica comes off mute. And she's come off mute. Monica, over to yourself.
Okay, I really want to flip my okay,
your screen. Okay, do you want to hit slideshow again to see if it works? And then we might be able to flip the screens around.
Then.
Yeah.
Better?
Perfect. Woohoo! Over to you. Yeah.
Okay. Firstly, thank you very much, and it is quite nice to be here with you guys. And thank you, Sarah. It's a brilliant idea to put all the industry together at one time. So fantastic, super. Well, these days I think that all of us, we are living this new experience of the pandemic. But I want to see it from a different angle, and I want to see how the industry brings a very valuable point. And I appreciate now when I'm far from mine engineering, and that this is beyond my capacities, but it is amazing how to hear Norm and all of you talking about a stakeholder engagement as part of the game. It's kind of the call of social science to be part of geoscience, and it is just science combined to make this work. So trust becomes part of that. So what I want to go here on this is I will start taking you from different perspectives, and you're going to see what I really want to mean. And the purpose of my talk is basically to see that in the industry, we build trust, and that is a big difference than other industries. So when you talk about this, we have communities asking, can we trust you? We have investors asking, can we trust you? We have governments asking, can we trust you? So the question is all the time, and has been before. And right now, in the times of a pandemic, it's even worse, because is these people as bad as that they can bring the disease to my town or to my community? So let's start from this. When the coronavirus came, I was just looking at and tried to see how much trust is in that, and investors collapsed. They just literally, they lose trust of the markets and the companies and how they will happen. And that's when we saw this. But this is a very short-term thinking when you see a collapse in the stock market, because it's very speculative. So obviously the trust that you build on that is just very short, so you don't have that one-on-one on that. And when we go and talk about, can we trust the state, can we trust the government, this area that is all where mostly mining is happening, obviously it's happening in Russia and other areas, but mostly that square goes on to show that mostly fragile states are located in these areas, and mining companies operate in these areas. So we have communities, governments, investors, everybody paying attention what mining is doing, knowing that mining works in high-risk areas in terms of political and social conflict. So can we trust the state? Can we trust the governments where we are working? Can we partner with them? And even the communities, can they trust them? And unfortunately, the answer in so many cases is the health system is just coming right now to see how much we trust the governments where we are in. And it doesn't have to be in a developing country or a country in a state of risk. We also see it in the developed world, that the health system is how you materialize the trust that we have to our own governments. Because right now we basically depend on the decisions made by people we have elected in a democratic process. Why I'm bringing this is that as an industry, we see two layers of distrust. The distrust of investors, because it put in risk is too much and they cannot perceive that. And we put another layer, which the layer of the government. Even as an industry, we have to accommodate what governments are doing today in the decisions they are making and how they are approaching. In some cases, they are doing the very best. In some cases, they don't. And we have to also to be aware that pandemics is not something that happens every day. So it caught by surprise the entire world. But when we go back to this, is that the world the world will ask us, why should we trust the mine industry? Why should we trust your operation? If the states, we cannot trust them, investors don't trust us, communities have huge questions, why should I trust the company? Well, I will tell you honestly that you can trust us, we can trust because we build trust. And why is coming onto that? When we talk about trust, and I have been working all my life on this, I mean, many years, and I always say a lot of mosquito bites in working in different regions and countries and with communities at all levels of development, it just comes to the fact that trust is something that every day you build. And I'm putting here just few points to make it clear, is that when we talk about social management systems, it just simply shows that we are organized. We are very organized in our approach. When we talk about a stakeholder engagement, it tells that we know you. We know where you live, we know who you are, we know who's the risk, we know your fears, we know challenges, we know you. And the study the needs and capacities is basically allows us to define solutions, because we understand the needs and we know our capacities, the state capacity and the community's capacity, so we can work together in solutions, and that's when collaboration comes into place. And this is not built in a short period of time, let's say from January to today in a world of pandemic, but it is built for many years that the industry has implemented good practices on the ground. When we are working on a stakeholder engagement, it's not the fact that you have a long list of stakeholders that happen to be in your area of influence. It happens that you know them, you know what triggers them, you know their challenges. Even for humanitarian aid, you know how to get there in the shortest period of time without any risk for your employees, for your workers, and the people helping you, and the communities accepting that. So the fact that we have all of this is a reason why you can trust us, because we know that region, that sometimes governments, and I can tell you from my very own experience, governments sometimes they don't even know they have settlements in certain areas. And we know because they are our workers. They go home to their families and we know by them by name. So that is the beauty of trust. And that is something that will take us to the social license. So the social license in times of a pandemic is just basically maintenance. You're not gonna get the social license at this time. This is just no way, it's impossible. If you didn't do a good job, or if you don't consider what is really a good job around social management, probably this is a very good opportunity to start thinking internally about how you're gonna build social management. Well, the social license basically is maintained because you come to communities with accurate information about the pandemic and about how to prevent, how to work together on this, and they trust you. You present something about wash your hands, maintain distance, and that probably they will trust you more than they will trust their own governments. And I have seen it what ICMM has done around this in some of the larger players, really playing an amazing role, and American is doing amazing, just going all across the communities in the area of influence because they know their communities and they know how to communicate. They know the local languages or they know the dialects and they can communicate accurately. The social network exists, so we can just spread. So it's just social capital is there and we can use it during this time because we can reach all of these channels that probably are not easy to reach at any other time. We know how to address the needs of communities. Some communities right now basically are looking for food aid. Some others are looking for medical assistance. Some communities are just looking for information. And some communities are really self-isolating out of fear. So how can we respect that? It's because we know their needs. So we can work around those needs in order to satisfy that. The protocols right now actually is becoming one of the things that is critically important to be very simple, because in some cases, municipalities are looking at these protocols to check if they will allow to start the operation, and they will trust you. And don't be surprised that in some regions in the world, your protocol is the only protocol that exists in that region. There might be governments that they don't have a full detailed protocol on how to operate. And the workers and the communities will trust that you can restart the operation because you have all of this. So it just goes back to my previous slide when I said, it is a matter that when social science has been part of geoscience, working together as a team, and we are working in a good social management system, we are ready. We are ready, and I have seen it. I have seen it with clients of mine that we are ready to work on scenarios as critical as this one. It's not the ideal scenario, but at least it really helps you to restart working. And one of the points that it really kind of was interesting is that I never ever thought in my career and all of these years that I will see a pandemic testing the work that we do. And it's become like a super test because it really tells you that all of these hours of engagement and communication, education, understanding, collaboration, participation, trust becomes an asset. Companies that will be able to restart a machine like this because the community is ready, just imagine how valuable will they be for investors. And it comes to me like, I was checking at Deloitte, had a good study about the trends in the mining industry. And number one is just the social investor. And it, for me, was very interesting, obviously, but it really connects the two. It connects the two because they just talk about that companies that go beyond that piece of compliance. And beyond that piece of compliance doesn't mean more money invested. No, it's wise money invested and seeing social management as an investment rather than a cost that we need to cut at some point. How this is efficient, and I think that right now the test is just, we're living the test. So thank you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Monica. As always, an absolutely fantastic talk. And those of you who can see my face, etc., you'll see that I've been replying to various comments that are coming in on YouTube. So whilst you were talking there, Monica, the fact that you started off with that word trust has sparked a really, really good discussion that's going on with those individuals who are watching us on YouTube. And just to give you the full context here, we've got a number of individuals who have very differing opinions with regards to mining within the likes of Portugal as a whole. And so I guess if we just leverage off that and taking advantage of this live conversation, Monica, when you're trying to build trust with different stakeholders or interested parties, or let's just call them people, when you're trying to build trust with those different individuals, do you have some hints or tips through which you can engage with people who don't necessarily want to come to the discussion? Or, you know, where there are, for various reasons, different barriers that are preventing people from being able to share what it is they want to say?
Well, it is a multi-million-dollar question, but I will use an analogy, and I will be probably all of us now, we correlate with that. It's just try to have a 2-year-old eating broccoli. So it's not very popular. So, but the point is that honesty equals trust. And sometimes, if we're going to tell the 2-year-old that broccoli is as delicious as Nutella, this broke the glass. It's not going to work. But the point is that comes into that discussions, and your approach to honesty is your approach to trust. If you are meeting stakeholders for the first time and they are reluctant, just be clear from point one that most of the time there is fear behind. And human beings, we react on fear. And the 2-year-old is fearful because that green thing doesn't look as good as the chocolate effect. And I won't put it in my mouth. So it's exactly the same as a community. Why do I want you, when you say that you're going to make a hole in the ground and everybody says that you're destroying, and the only thing I have is my house and my land. And on top of that, back in my mind, I know that I don't have legal rights because I don't have a document. I just have years living in this land. I'm fearful. I'm losing my house just by having you in front of me. So every single human being comes from something. And most of the time, fear is the ones that either creates a greater opportunity for a good conversation to know where the fear comes from, or the most horrific reaction. And we have seen shutdowns and horrible things around conflict. So fear is to be treated with extremely respect, and we don't do that. We don't treat the fear of others with respect. When you treat it with respect, you will have a conversation, and the conversation will take you to the next time. And that's how you build trust, step by step.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm here in my mind working out the analogies of respect the broccoli. Sorry, no, respect the fear. That's absolutely brilliant. And so I guess building on that, then, Monica, if you have, obviously everybody wants to do the right thing. And everybody has fears, and they also have opportunities, etc. as well. If you have, say, intermediary groups who are perhaps, say, representing other groups of people who are actually the ones that perhaps you're trying to engage with, are there any ways in which you can better interact with those kind of intermediary or gatekeepers that you sometimes find in these situations?
Yeah. I mean, that goes one-on-one to that conversation that you have in your communities and the honesty on that. If we just, there are many gatekeepers everywhere, and they have private agendas, and corruption has been huge in so many of the jurisdictions where mining is. And the point with that is that they learn that way. So it's kind of, we are going to work with communities to work with them on a different way. And this is, once again, fear comes into game, but this is the only thing I know. So why are you going to take me a different way? So understanding that also is part of your research. And I'm going to go back one step back, Sarah, because I think it's very important. Sometimes companies tend to think wrongly that when you do a stakeholder engagement, you just hire 3 people from the town because they know everybody. Yes, you want local workforce. You want locals because they know the story. But the mindset behind a social management system is a whole strategy. That's when I associate social strategy with social investment. You really need to have a very good framework on that, because the stories that come from those locals will make you understand and place it in your boxes of a strategy. Some gatekeepers might be politicians that really they do everything just to be in power for the next year, but they won't care about the next 20 years or 10 years ahead for the mine and the community. Might be that it is religious organization that happens to be very close to the mine and is nobody's want to go to their church because of this. Might be so many things, but those so many things is not out of gossip. And I'm gonna go into this because gatekeepers at the local level or even at the national level, they feed themselves on gossip. But when you collect the stories and you have an organized social management system, those stories will make sense and you can bring an answer to that. You can tell the politician 20 years ahead of the game, you will be the first one starting the whole process of reinventing the region. That is interesting. I want to talk to you. You want to talk to the church and say, well, how many people visit your church? How about if we go around to understand your community? How much do you understand your community? Can I learn from you? There's so many things and layers that once again, once you have a strategy around the approach, you know even the timing. Some stakeholders need to observe, Sarah. Some of them, they want to see what is happening because they are not risk takers, or they are taking too many risks and they have been totally failed by their own people. So why I'm going to pay attention to a mining company when my own politician is doing this to me? So observing is part of the game. All the time we hear about this listening, but what is listening? Listening is everything, but that comes in an organized way. And that is what sometimes we fail to do, to bring all the pieces in one organized puzzle, put it this way.
Brilliant. Okay, so listening, trust, respect the fear, broccoli and Nutella. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Monica. Another round of applause for you. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, before you log off, those of you who were here right at the start will know that today is a special day because we actually have an extra talk for you. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this conference that only started to be organized 2 and a bit weeks ago keeps attracting attention, which is fantastic. So just whilst Monica stops sharing her screen there, Alexander, if you want to come off mute and begin to take over the controls from your end, I would love to welcome to our virtual stage, ladies and gentlemen, our final and bonus speaker of today. Is Alexander still here or has he dropped off?
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Fantastic, excellent. Okie dokes. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your virtual hands together for the final presentation of today, Geoethics and Georesources. Alexander, over to yourself.
Okay, nice to talk on this end of the afternoon from Portugal. Thanks for accepting me due to all these different issues related with computers and internet. I was with problems getting the presentation, but it's ready for that. So I just want to share some of our work that we are developing in Portugal, and is related with geoethics and georesources. And we are working in this project called GOAL. So we have the geoethics outcomes and awareness learning, that is a co-funded Erasmus project from Europe. And we decided to, in our department, to put some energy on this because we felt that it's really important to explain to the people what is going on with georesources and why we need them in order that we can work in our research. So first, I would like to talk about a little about conflict of interest, because I'm a teacher here at the University of Porto, and you can have access to all my interests in research. By my webpage, you can see in which department I work, which institution, what are my PhD students, my master students. You have access to almost everything, but some people don't know, but I have also the conflict of interest in the materials that I use. For instance, I have a smartphone, like most of you, and I drive an electric car like this one that is here. So I'm really interested in raw materials because I'm using them all the time. And this is the first thing that the people need to understand when we talk about conflict of interest, is about everything. So in January the last year, we had the first workshop related with these georesources and geological resources and geoethics. And we choose the example of the lithium from hard rock, because as I will try to explain in a few moments, but before that, I organized the thing just to have a quick look why I choose the lithium from hard rock. It's because I did my PhD 20 years ago. I finished them in northern Portugal about lithium, and later I start my research and my way in the faculty. I participate in many different H2020 projects like FAME project. There, I mean, new ores, development of new models about lithium, for instance, with a lot of different institutions. At the moment, we are working in Eramin 2 project called LIGHTS, that is use the exploration from satellites to ground portable equipments in order to have almost no contact with the terrain before the mining, because before the mining we need to do exploration, and for the exploration we can use from satellites to drones to portable elements, portable equipments like portable lips. And at this moment, we never touch the ground and the rock. And it's only exploration. It's only to research and to do the study about our terrain. And very recently, we have the kickoff in June this year. We have the project Green Pact, that is a H2020 project for 4 years that will start this June. And it's similar, but with different approaches, like using geophysical from helicopters and other things. Tomorrow, Francis will hope that explain that she is in charge of the social impact that this kind of exploration related with pegmatites and lithium pegmatites are included on these ones. And so we gonna do research on this area for a long time in my department and with my team. And it's why we decided to explain to people that why we need lithium. And about that, I just want to make a quick overview about the lithium resources. Until, let's say, 2016-17, when the price of lithium rise a lot, most of the lithium was coming from lithium resources in brines. As you know, they are mainly from South America. But if you go, this is in Spanish, but anyway, you can understand that all this lithium that is being mined all over the world in the last decades is coming mainly from these brines, and this causes problems to the local people. They have problems related with the underground water, that they have no access. So we are using lithium that is coming from all over the world. In this case, before 2 years ago, it was mainly from brines, but at the moment is coming mostly from lithium pegmatites from mainly Australia. And we decided to use the case of Portugal because there's a lot of resources that are being developed since my PhD. 2000, there was a lot of new discoveries that at that moment they were used to get material for the ceramic and glass industry, so raw material for the ceramic and glass industry at that moment. But now there's some interest in, like in Australia, that some of these resources, they can be mined for lithium to be used on in the batteries, like lithium hydroxide and lithium carbonate. And there are always geoethics related with all this. You can see in this cross section that was taken by from the webpage of the Savannah Resources that there's, during the exploration, there's the possibility of propose different approaches to the mining. So they have a proposal that there's an open pit one open pit at stage 2. And this is a proposal. This vein that you can see here, it's proposed to be mined by open pit, but maybe it's not possible. Maybe it's important to do underground mining after 50 meters, 80 meters of open pit. You need to go in underground. So we decide to take all this in account and make some studies in order to understand the near future. And what we felt from the first year of research, because we are doing questionnaires to the local people and doing some research on this, the European seems to think that should the mining be operated only on developing and third world countries and not mined in the first world countries, or not mined at all. And this, of course, is a trouble for the geoethics because, well, we can discuss this later. So how can society evolve towards a more sustainable way of life where resources are consumed sparsely if most citizens are not aware on the raw material cost of their consumption habits? It's why we are planning a lot of different conferences and visits to schools, because we believe that only if we explain from the, let's say, primary school to the university how much is involved in each material that they are using all the day, from the time that they wake up until the time that they go to bed again. It's amazing the amount of different raw materials that they need, and we need to understand them. So I promised that I was really using only 10 minutes. And so for me, geoscience education is the answer for a sustainable role, because only if the people really understand what are the implications of their use is possible that we make the right decisions. If we do exploration and we discover something, we need to decide after this discovery if we should be mining, and if it should be open pit mining, if it should be underground mining. So it's something that needs to be really discussed after the exploration. And okay, thank you. And this image is from northern Portugal, And what you can see in the middle, it's not a lithium mine, it's a raw material, ceramic and glass, well, raw material mine for the ceramic and the glass industry. And of course it has lithium. And I know that it's a nice landscape, and you can see here let's say an area with open pit. But some of these, I finish with this, some of these raw material that was coming from here, it was in the plates that most of the people, some of the people eat it today in their plates, the food that they get on these ceramics. Okay, thanks for all.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Alexander. Obrigada for your brilliant presentation that you put together so quickly. Now, I don't know if Catriona is still with us because she was asking questions that are very, very much related to your second last slide that you had there with regards to this conundrum within Europe. So it's a case of, do we want mining within our boundaries? Or do we want it all to come from somewhere else? You know, what is the solution here? And again, we've got some chatter going on with regards to the self-chosen ignorance regarding the sources of materials of first world consumers. So I think that you've got an awful lot of people who are agreeing with you through the chatter, etc., and some really good discussion that you have sparked there. Is there something with regards to the education and the awareness around geoscience and where all of those raw materials come from? So where do these rocks come from to be turned into something like one of these? Do you have any suggestions for resources that we can go and look at, or any links that we should go and look at to better educate both ourselves, but also help us when we're trying to communicate with other people?
In the Erasmus project called GOAL, we put some geological education, well, some educational resources in order to let the schools get the material well informed about the implications and the way that we get the material. I think that this is available on the abstract that is in your webpage. So we started 1 year ago, and we are dealing with teachers to help us on get the best educational materials in order that they can be used in the classroom to explain. And we choose the example of lithium because most of the people are used to listen about this word, and the people normally they don't associate with the element, they associate with the batteries, and they don't even imagine that they are related the rock with something that they use all day in the smartphone. So we're gonna use this example, and these educational resources are on the webpage of the Erasmus project.
Sorry, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And I think this is something here where I know that we still have on the line a wide array of individuals who at their fingertips have some brilliant resources that can help with this communication and with this sharing. So please do feel free to send through those links to Rose and myself, and we'll post them on the website. And I think maybe, Alexander, just to add to what you were saying there, if I quickly share my screen, many of you will have seen this poster before. This is from the Geological Society. And this is one of the many educational bits of information they put together. And as you can see here, this is where geoscience as a whole is absolutely crucial for the future and key aspects with regards to human beings as a whole. So I'm sure you've already seen this one, Alexander, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And all of the other resources.
And it was translated to Portuguese already for someone from our Geological Society. Yeah.
Fantastic, or beleza, as some people might say. You've now exhausted my Portuguese, by the way. So with that, I think massive thank you to yourself, Alexander. A big round of applause to yourself. And to say thank you very much to you. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to gallery view so you can see all of the lovely faces of our brilliant speakers who have spoken to us this afternoon and contributed their wisdom, their thoughts, their ideas, and their challenges. So the conversation this afternoon, it wasn't all Nutella and it wasn't all broccoli. Monica, I'm going to use that for a while now. This was a case here where we learned from the likes of Andrew, we're not running out of this stuff. That is not the critical issue here. We're not running out of these key elements. Actually, there are some other much bigger risks that we need to be able to deal with and focus on first. At least I think that was your message, Andrew. I don't think you had any passion behind that. No, this is sarcasm, by the way. So brilliant. Thank you very much from yourself, Andrew. And then from Richard, the ins and outs with regards to cobalt. And I have to say, I'm greatly looking forward to when we do actually we are able to actually sustainably mine all of those seafloor nodules and harvest all of the lovely bits and pieces that sit in there. And we've been talking about it for a long time. Surely we should be able to bring it to bear in the near future. I'm going to skip over those lovely ladies who are keeping their video cameras off just in case they're in the middle of their supper or something like that. But also we heard from Norm and where he proposed some new ideas with regards to how should we actually design our mind. And I think, Norm, some of what you were saying links in really nicely to what Zach and Aidan were saying this morning about when we're trying to look at the value of these assets, do we look at the whole value? And I've certainly got lots of questions for you around when we're trying to value a project and the age-old problems with using things like net present value and all of that kind of stuff, which doesn't actually allow you to see the full extent, the full life of that asset, and also bring in some of those other factors as well. A massive thank you as well to Jess, who has been there beavering away and recording the salient points from what we've been saying. So Jess will be posting a blog or a summary of what we've spoken about this afternoon. And as ever, a massive, massive thank you to Rose, who has kept the show on the road and managed to keep us all going. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Rose. Look, we're all applauding you. We're all applauding you. Yes, I know, it's so embarrassing. Take the applause. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, of course, we're not there yet. We still have lots more glorious talks for you tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, we kick off as ever, bright and early at 8 o'clock UK time. And we're going to be joined by Ivy Chen from Australia, and she's going to be sharing some insight with regards to how the Australians incorporate environment, social and governance into the geological reporting code, so to JORC. So for those of us who love the world of geology, so Ivy's going to be talking to us about JORC. We're then going to be joined by a huge array of other fantastic individuals, and we're going to be looking at everything from gold fingerprinting. We're going to be looking at, again, more responsible sourcing of minerals. It's obviously a theme that's coming through with regards to this. We're going to be looking at carbon after COVID, and I think we've all seen lots of articles talking about carbon, etc., and how COVID may be helping all of these issues with regards to climate change, but then what happens after we emerge from the COVID crisis. Then we're going to be hearing from Ima Didi talking about waste not, want not, the advantages of understanding metal budgets in alternative resources. And then we come back to the world of lithium again, and Lucy Crane from Cornish Lithium is going to be talking about building responsible supply chains and an example from one of the lithium projects that we have here in the UK. Then we're going to hop across to Europe, not that the UK isn't in Europe. I almost mentioned that B word. It would be wonderful if we could get through a conference in the UK or has been hosted in the UK without mentioning that word that begins with B, so I won't mention it. But Mark Rakovides from Euromines is going to talk about lessons in the new normal, so mining Europe with regards to Europe's needs. And then we're going to finish off the session tomorrow morning. Bear in mind there's another one tomorrow afternoon with the wonderful Ruth Allington, who's going to be talking about the value of multidisciplinary risk assessments through dialogue and joined up thinking. And her talk is also called Mind the Gaps, so plural. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, my little head is buzzing with ideas and excitement. I hope you guys have taken away some fantastic learning and challenges and aha moments. So with that, have a lovely evening, stay safe, and see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much. Richard, I love your suggestion.
Actually, you know, we were going to do the Royal Society Summer Exhibition